High above the English Channel, aboard the luxurious Prometheus airliner, a sinister plot unfolds. A wasp buzzes, a woman gasps, and a deadly thorn finds its mark. When Madame Giselle, a notorious moneylender, is found dead mid-flight, Hercule Poirot's razor-sharp mind is the only hope to unravel the truth. Who among the eclectic passengers, lovesick hairdresser, secretive countess, or cunning dentist, wielded a mysterious blowpipe? Why was the killer so bold? And what secrets did Giselle take to her grave? Step into the clouds for a skyward suspense where no one is above suspicion. Chapter 1. The Prometheus takes flight. The air hung thick with the scent of fuel and anticipation as Hercule Poirot stepped onto the tarmac at La Bougette Aerodrome, Paris, on a crisp autumn morning in 1935. The sun, still low, cast long shadows across the airfield, where the sleek airliner Prometheus gleamed like a silver arrow against the pale sky. Its propellers stood still, but the promise of their roar vibrated in the air, a mechanical heartbeat waiting to pulse. Poirot adjusted his immaculate Homburg hat, his gloved fingers brushing a speck of dust from his tailored overcoat. He loathed air travel, the hum of engines, the lurch of ascent, the faint queasiness that mocked his usually unassailable composure. Yet duty called, and a case in London demanded his little grey cells. The steward, a wiry young man named Henry Mitchell, with a nervous smile, greeted him at the steps. "Monsieur Poirot, welcome aboard. Seat No. 9, just this way." His accent was clipped, his manner overly eager, as if he sensed the detective's reputation and felt the weight of it. Poirot nodded, his moustache twitching faintly, and climbed the narrow steps into the cabin. The interior was a marvel of modern design, yet cramped. 12 seats arranged in 2 neat rows, 6 on each side, upholstered in green leather. The walls were panelled in polished wood, and small windows offered glimpses of the tarmac below. A faint hum of conversation greeted him as he settled into his seat, his cane propped beside him to his left. In seat No. 10 sat Jane Grey, a young hairdresser with auburn curls pinned neatly beneath a modest hat. Her fingers fidgeted with a dog-eared novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, and Poirot suppressed a smile at the irony. She glanced at him, her hazel eyes bright but restless, as if she carried a secret she wasn't sure she wanted to keep. Across the aisle, in seat No. 2, the Countess of Horbury lounged with the careless elegance of wealth. Her fur stole slipped slightly, revealing a silk dress that clung to her like a second skin. She was beautiful, in a predatory way, her dark eyes scanning the cabin with a mix of boredom and calculation. Poirot noted the slight tremor in her hand as she lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly before she exhaled a plume of smoke. Further back, in seat No. 12, Madame Giselle, a French moneylender of notorious repute, sat with the stillness of a statue. Her severe black dress and tightly coiled hair gave her the air of a governess. But her reputation told another story, one of ruthless financial dealings and whispered blackmail. Poirot had heard of her in Paris salons, where her name was spoken. In hushed, wary tones, she clutched a leather-bound ledger, her fingers possessive, her gaze fixed on some distant point. The cabin filled steadily. Norman Gale, a dentist with a boyish grin and polished shoes, took seat No. 1, directly across from the Countess. His eyes lingered on Jane Grey, and Poirot caught the faint flush in her cheeks as she returned his glance. In seats No. 5 and 6, the Dupont-Sarmond and Jean, father and son, archaeologists huddled over a sketch of an ancient urn, their voices low and intense. Their tweed suits were dusted with the faint grit of excavation sites, and their conversation danced between French and English, peppered with references to Sumerian relics. Daniel Clancy, a mystery writer with a rumpled suit and inked fingers, occupied seat No. 8, muttering to himself as he scribbled in a notebook. His eyes darted nervously, as if he expected his own plots to spring to life. The final passengers included James Ryder, a brusque businessman in seat No. 4, whose loud complaints about the stock market carried over the hum of the engines warming up, and to others a quiet doctor and a reclusive spinster who seemed content to fade into the background. The second steward, Albert Davis, bustled about, checking tickets and offering coffee with a practiced smile. Poirot observed it all, his mind cataloguing details, the way Ryder's cufflinks glinted with new money, the faint scent of lavender from the spinster's handbag, the wasp that buzzed insistently against Jane Grey's window as the Prometheus taxied down the runway. Poirot gripped the armrests, his stomach lurching with the plane's ascent. The cabin tilted, and Paris shrank below, a patchwork of rooftops and boulevards, swallowed by clouds. The passengers settled into their routines, Jane reading, the Countess smoking, Clancy scribbling, the Duponts whispering. But Poirot's unease wasn't just from the altitude. Something in the air felt wrong, like a note played slightly off-key. He closed his eyes, willing his nausea away, and focused on the sounds, the drone of the engines, the rustle of pages, the soft clink of a spoon against a cup. "Pardon," Monsieur Henry Mitchell said, leaning over Poirot's seat. "Would you care for a drink? Coffee, perhaps, or something stronger to ease the flight?" His tone was polite, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the rear of the cabin. "Nan, merci," Poirot replied, his voice smooth despite his discomfort. "But tell me, monsieur, this waspit is bothersome, no? Does it trouble the other passengers?" Mitchell blinked, surprised. "Oh, the wasp. Just one, I think. It's been buzzing about Miss Gray's seat, but it's harmless enough. I'll swat it if it gets worse." He hesitated, then added, "Anything else I can do for you, sir?" Poirot waved him off, his gaze lingering on the steward's retreating figure. Harmless, perhaps, but Poirot disliked coincidences. A wasp, in a sealed cabin. It was curious, if not suspicious. He turned his attention to Jane Grey, who was now engaged in a halting conversation with Norman Gale across the aisle. "You're reading Agatha Christie," Gale said, his smile warm. "She's rather clever, isn't she? All those twists and turns." Jane laughed, a touch self-conscious, "I suppose. I like how her detective Poirot sees things others miss. It's like he's always one step ahead." Poirot's mustache twitched again, but he kept his eyes half closed, feigning disinterest. Jane's admiration was flattering, but her words carried a nervous edge, as if she were deflecting something. Gale, too, seemed too polished, his charm a little too deliberate. Poirot filed the observation away, his mind already weaving a tapestry of possibilities. The flight droned on, the Channel's grey expanse visible through the windows. The Countess of Horbury extinguished her cigarette and beckoned Mitchell for a glass of champagne. Her voice, low and husky, carried a demand rather than a request. "And make it quick, darling, I'm parched." Mitchell nodded, his smile strained, and hurried to the small galley at the rear. Poirot noted the exchange, as well as the way Madame Giselle's eyes followed the Countess, sharp and unblinking. Halfway through the flight, the cabin grew quieter, the initial buzz of conversation fading into the monotony of travel. Poirot, fighting his queasiness, opened his eyes fully and scanned the compartment. Clancy was still scribbling, his pen scratching furiously. The Duponts had fallen silent, their heads bent close over their sketch. Ryder was dozing, his newspaper slipping from his lap, and then a small movement caught Poirot's eye, a faint glint near Madame Giselle's seat, like a needle catching the light. He leaned forward, squinting, but before he could focus, Mitchell's voice broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in Croydon shortly. Please prepare for descent." His tone was professional, but there was a tremor in it, a hitch that made Poirot's senses sharpen. The steward moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts, but paused at Madame Giselle's seat. His face paled, and he froze, one hand hovering over her shoulder. "Monsieur," Poirot called softly, rising from his seat. The other passengers stirred, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Jane Grey looked up, her book forgotten. The Countess turned, her cigarette halfway to her lips. Even Clancy stopped writing, his pen hovering. Mitchell turned, his eyes wide. She's not moving, sir. Madame Giselle, I think she's..." Poirot was at his side in an instant, his nausea forgotten. He leaned over the woman in seat No. 12, his gloved fingers gently tilting her head. Her eyes were open, staring blankly, her face frozen in a mask of calm. A tiny puncture mark marred her neck, a single drop of blood glistening like a ruby. Poirot's heart quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of a puzzle. This was no accident, no sudden illness. This was murder, committed in the confined, impossible space of a soaring airliner. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "It begins." The cabin erupted into chaos. Jane gasped, clutching her book. The Countess dropped her cigarette, her face ashen. Gale stood, his charm replaced by confusion. The Duponts exchanged a glance, their sketch forgotten. Clancy's notebook fell to the floor, his mutterings silenced. Only Poirot remained calm, his eyes sweeping the cabin, cataloguing every reaction, every flicker of fear or guilt. "Remain seated, s'il vous plaît," he said, his voice cutting through the panic like a blade. "No one must move until we land. Monsieur Mitchell, summon your colleague and ensure the door to the cockpit remains closed." Mitchell nodded, stumbling toward the galley. Poirot knelt beside Madame Giselle, his fingers probing delicately. The puncture was precise, almost surgical, and near it, caught in the folds of her scarf, was a tiny thorn, no longer than a matchstick. He plucked it free with a handkerchief, his mind racing. A poisoned dart, in an airliner. The audacity was staggering. As the Prometheus descended toward Croydon, the passengers whispered and stared, their faces a gallery of suspicion and dread. Poirot returned to his seat, the thorn safely tucked away, and closed his eyes, not to sleep but to think. 11 passengers, 2 stewards, a confined cabin, and a dead woman. The wasp, the blowpipe, the ledger, the glances, every detail was a piece of the puzzle, and Hercule Poirot was determined to fit them together. The plane touched down with a jolt, and the cabin fell silent, save for the hum of the engines winding down. Poirot opened his eyes, his gaze steady. The game was afoot, and in the skyward suspense of the Prometheus, a killer hid among them. The chapter closed with Poirot's quiet resolve, the weight of the mystery settling over him like a storm cloud, promising revelations yet to come. Chapter 2. The Poisoned Thorn. The Prometheus airliner descended through a veil of grey clouds, its propellers humming a steady drone as it touched down on the tarmac at Croydon Aerodrome. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the residue of travel-stale cigarette smoke, the faint tang of coffee, and the nervous energy of passengers eager to disembark. Hercule Poirot, seated in No. 9, clutched his armrests, his knuckles pale as he fought the queasy churn of motion sickness. His neatly trimmed mustache quivered slightly, betraying his discomfort, but his sharp grey eyes remained vigilant, scanning the cabin even as the plane jolted to a stop. The steward, Henry Mitchell, a wiry man with a perpetually furrowed brow, moved through the aisle, checking seatbelts and offering strained smiles. "All right, ladies and gentlemen," he called, his voice clipped with the efficiency of routine. "We've arrived in London. Please remain seated until the captain gives the all clear." Poirot adjusted his silk tie, smoothing it with a fastidious flick of his fingers, and glanced at the passengers around him. To his left, Jane Grey, the young hairdresser with auburn curls, fumbled with her handbag, her cheeks flushed from a whispered exchange with the handsome dentist, Norman Gale. Across the aisle, behind her, the Countess of Horbury, Lady Cicely, lounged in seat No. 13, her fur stole slipping off one shoulder as she lit another cigarette, her coal-lined eyes darting nervously. Daniel Clancy, the dishevelled mystery writer, scribbled furiously in a notebook, muttering about plot twists under his breath. The Duponts, father and son archaeologists, sat stiffly, their faces etched with the intensity of men who carried secrets heavier than their luggage. And then there was Madame Giselle, the French moneylender, seated directly behind Poirot in No. 12. Her silence as imposing as her reputation. The cabin door swung open, admitting a gust of damp English air, and Mitchell began ushering passengers toward the exit. Poirot, however, remained seated, his gaze fixed on Madame Giselle. She had not stirred since the plane began its descent, her head tilted at an odd angle against the window. Her gloved hands rested limply in her lap, and her face, framed by a severe black hat, was unnaturally still. A faint prickle of unease crept up Poirot's spine. "Monsieur Mitchell said," approaching Poirot with a hesitant frown, "we're ready to disembark. If you'd be so kind." Poirot raised a hand, his voice calm but commanding. "Un moment, Monsieur Mitchell. I observed that Madame Giselle does not move. Perhaps you might check on her." Mitchell's frown deepened, but he nodded and stepped past Poirot to the row behind. He leaned over the moneylender, his polite inquiry faltering midst, Madame Giselle." His hand hovered over her shoulder, then drew back as if burned. "Good Lord," he gasped, his face draining of color. "She's not breathing." A ripple of murmurs spread through the remaining passengers. Jane Grey turned, her eyes wide. Norman Gale stood, his jaw tight, while Lady Cicely's cigarette froze halfway to her lips. Poirot rose smoothly, his nausea forgotten, and joined Mitchell at Madame Giselle's side. The woman's eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Her lips tinged a faint blue. A small, dark mark marred the side of her neck, barely visible against her pale skin. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, leaning closer. With the precision of a surgeon, he tilted her head slightly, revealing a tiny thorn embedded in the flesh, its tip glistening with an unnatural sheen. "This is no accident," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the cabin. "This is murder." The Croydon Aerodrome Terminal was a hive of chaos by the time the authorities arrived. Passengers milled about, their faces a mix of shock and impatience. While airport staff cordoned off the Prometheus, Poirot stood near the plane's gangway, his hands clasped behind his back, observing the scene with the detached curiosity of a chess master studying a board. The other passengers had been herded into a private lounge, their luggage stacked haphazardly under the watchful eye of a constable. Jane Grey clutched her coat, her earlier flirtation with Norman Gale replaced by a nervous fidgeting. Lady Cicely paced, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor, while Daniel Clancy muttered to himself, scribbling notes as if the murder were researched for his next novel. Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard strode into the terminal, his overcoat flapping and his face set in a familiar scowl. "Poirot," he barked, spotting the detective. "What's this I hear about a murder on a blasted aeroplane? Can't you take a flight without stumbling over a corpse?" Poirot's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Mon cher Japp, it is not I who creates the crimes, but the criminals who insist on performing them in my presence. Come, you must see the body." Japp followed Poirot back to the Prometheus, grumbling about the inconvenience of mid-air murders. Inside the cabin, Madame Giselle remained as Poirot had left her, her stillness a stark contrast to the flurry of activity outside. Japp crouched beside her, his eyes narrowing at the thorn in her neck. "What's this then? Some kind of dart?" Poirot said, his voice low. "A thorn, I believe, coated with a poison, likely a venom of some exotic origin, perhaps curare or a derivative. The delivery, however, is what intrigues me." He gestured to the floor beneath his own seat, where a slender bamboo tube, no longer than a fountain pen, lay partially concealed by a folded newspaper. "A blowpipe, Inspector. A most curious choice for a modern airliner, Nan." Japp picked up the blowpipe with a handkerchief, turning it over in his hands. "South American, by the look of it. Who brings a ruddy blowpipe on a plane, and how'd they get it past the stewards?" "That," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming, "is the question. But there is more. Observe the cabin, Inspector. 11 passengers were seated in this rear compartment, including myself. The blowpipe was found under my seat, yet I assure you, I am not in the habit of carrying such rustic implements." Japp snorted. "You're telling me you're a suspect now? That's rich." He straightened, his expression darkening. "Right then. Nobody leaves until we've got statements from every last one of them. And you, Poirot, don't go playing hero. This is my case." Poirot inclined his head, his smile enigmatic. "I am but an observer, mon ami, but I will observe most carefully." The lounge where the passengers were detained was a sterile, high-ceilinged room with uncomfortable chairs and a single window overlooking the tarmac. The air was thick with tension, punctuated by the occasional cough or rustle of a newspaper. Poirot stood near the door, his hands folded, watching as Japp and 2 constables began taking statements. Henry Mitchell, the steward, was first, his hands twisting nervously as he spoke. "I didn't see nothing out of the ordinary, sir," Mitchell said, his voice strained. "Served drinks, checked the cabin, same as always. There was a wasp buzzing about, mind you, annoyed a few passengers, but I didn't see no blowpipe, I swear." "A wasp?" Japp's eyebrows shot up. "You're saying a wasp might have done this?" Poirot interjected, his tone gentle but firm. "Monsieur Mitchell, this wasp, where did you see it?" Mitchell hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. "Near the back, sir. By Madame Giselle's seat, I reckon. One of the ladies, Miss Grey, I think swatted at it during the flight." Poirot nodded, filing the detail away. "And the blowpipe, monsieur? You did not notice anyone handling such an object?" "No, sir," Mitchell said quickly. Too quickly, Poirot thought, noting the faint sheen of sweat on the steward's brow. "I was busy with the service. Couldn't watch everyone." Japp dismissed Mitchell and moved on to Jane Grey, who sat clutching her handbag as if it were a lifeline. "Miss Grey," Japp said, his tone softening slightly, "you were in seat, no 16. Across from Mr. Gale. Did you see anything unusual? Anyone near Madame Giselle? Jane's cheeks flushed, and she glanced at Norman Gale, who stood nearby, his expression one of polite concern. I was distracted, she admitted. Norman, Mr. Gale and I were talking, but I did see that wasp. It was buzzing near my tray, and I swatted it away. I didn't think much of it. Poirot tilted his head, his gaze piercing. And Madame Giselle, Mademoiselle, did you notice her during the flight? Jane shook her head, her curls bouncing. She was quiet. I thought she was sleeping. She had this stern look about her, even sitting still. I didn't look too closely. As Japp moved on to Norman Gale, Poirot's attention shifted to Lady Cicely Horbury, who was whispering urgently to her maid, Elise, in the corner. The Countess's hands trembled as she lit another cigarette, her eyes darting toward the door. Poirot approached, his steps silent on the tiled floor. Madame la Comtesse, he said, bowing slightly. A word, if you please. You were seated in No. 13, directly across from Madame Giselle. Did you, perhaps, observe anything out of the ordinary? Lady Cicely's laugh was sharp, almost brittle. Ordinary, on a plane with a dead woman. Really, Monsieur Poirot, you do ask the most absurd questions. She exhaled a plume of smoke, her eyes narrowing. I was reading a magazine. I didn't notice anything. Not the wasp, not the woman, nothing. Poirot's smile was polite but unyielding. And yet, Madame, you seem unsettled. Perhaps you knew Madame Giselle. Her hand froze, the cigarette trembling. Knew her. Why would I know a moneylender? Her voice was too high, her denial too quick. Poirot merely nodded, stepping back as Japp called for the next passenger. The interrogation continued for hours, each passenger offering a mix of half-truths and nervous deflections. Daniel Clancy, the mystery writer, spoke at length about the artistic merit of a blowpipe murder, his eyes gleaming with unsettling enthusiasm. It's brilliant, don't you think? A dart, a puff of air, and poof, death in the clouds. I might use it in my next book. Japp rolled his eyes. Save it for the publisher, Mr. Clancy. Did you see anyone with a blowpipe? Clancy blinked, as if startled by the question. Me? No, I was writing, lost in my thoughts. But I did see that wasp, nasty little thing. Could it have carried the poison? Poirot's lips twitched. A most imaginative theory, Monsieur Clancy. But I fear the wasp is innocent. The Duponts, Armand and Jean, were next. Their responses clipped and academic. We were discussing our recent dig in Persia, Armand said, his voice dry as dust. Madame Giselle was of no interest to us, and the blowpipe, Japp pressed. You've traveled in South America, haven't you? Ever seen one used? Jean, the younger Dupont, smiled faintly. In museums, Inspector, not in aeroplanes. As the interviews concluded, Japp pulled Poirot aside, his face grim. This lot's a mess, Poirot. Half of Mr. lying, and the other half are too scared to tell the truth. That blowpipe's got me stumped. Who'd be daft enough to use it in a crowded cabin? Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet intensity. Someone bold, Inspector, someone who believed they could act unseen. But they were mistaken. He paused, his gaze drifting to the passengers. The murderer is among the 11 in this rear compartment. The blowpipe was placed under my seat to confuse, to distract. But Hercule Poirot is not so easily misled. Japp grunted, unconvinced. You're saying it's one of them, even the girl, Miss Grey? Poirot shook his head. Mademoiselle Grey is unlikely. Her heart is too open, her fear too genuine. But the others, he trailed off, his fingers brushing his mustache. There is a pattern here, Inspector, a pattern of misdirection. The wasp, the blowpipe, the thorn, all pieces of a puzzle designed to obscure the truth. Japp sighed, rubbing his temples. Right, I'll have the constables search their luggage again. Maybe we'll find something. You sticking around, Poirot? Poirot nodded, his expression serene but resolute. I shall remain, mon ami. The little grey cells, they are already at work, and they tell me the truth is closer than we think. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the aerodrome, Poirot stood alone by the Prometheus, his eyes tracing the lines of the plane's fuselage. The cabin, now empty save for Madame Giselle's body, seemed to hum with secrets. He stepped inside, his movements deliberate, and knelt beside his former seat. The blowpipe was gone, taken by Japp's men, but Poirot's mind replayed the scene, the cramped space, the fleeting glances. the wasp's distracting buzz. He straightened, his gaze settling on Madame Giselle's seat. The thorn, the venom, the blowpipe, they were not random. They were chosen, and the choice, Poirot knew, was the key. Someone in that cabin had orchestrated a murder with the precision of a symphony, every note calculated to mislead. But Hercule Poirot was no ordinary audience. He would find the conductor. Chapter 3. Suspects in the Skyward airliner. Prometheus had barely touched down at Croydon Airport when the weight of Madame Giselle's death settled over its passengers like a storm cloud. The cabin, once a cocoon of chatter and clinking glasses, now felt like a cage. Hercule Poirot, his travel sickness mercifully fading, sat upright in seat No. 9, his sharp eyes darting from face to face. The passengers, a motley collection of strangers, bound by the shared horror of a mid-air murder, shuffled uneasily as Inspector Japp's men herded them into a private lounge for questioning. The room, with its stale air and chipped wooden table, hummed with tension, each person a potential killer, each glance a possible accusation. Poirot adjusted his bow tie, his mind already slicing through the chaos. 11 suspects, all seated in the rear compartment of the Prometheus, where Madame Giselle had met her end. The blowpipe, that curious relic of a weapon, lay at the heart of the puzzle. Its presence under Poirot's own seat, a taunt from the murderer. He glanced at Inspector Japp, whose bulldog face was set in a scowl as he barked orders to his constables. Japp's methods were blunt, but Poirot knew they would unearth the raw facts. It was up to him, however, to weave those facts into truth. "Let us begin, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice a velvet murmur that cut through the room's din. "We have a murderer among us, and they are clever. But Hercule Poirot is cleverer still." Japp grunted, flipping open his notebook. "Right then, let's get this lot sorted. 11 passengers, 2 stewards. Someone's got blood on their hands, and I'll wager it's not as exotic as that blowpipe suggests." The first to face their scrutiny was Jane Grey, the young hairdresser, whose wide, hazel eyes betrayed a nervous energy. She sat across from Poirot and Japp, her hands twisting a handkerchief into knots. Her auburn hair, neatly pinned, gleamed under the lounge's harsh lights, but her face was pale, her lips trembling as she spoke. "I didn't know her," Jane said, her voice soft but firm. "Madame Giselle, I mean. I was in seat No. 16, near the front of the compartment. I spent most of the flight while chatting with Mr. Gale." A flush crept up her cheeks, and she glanced away, as if embarrassed by the admission. Poirot tilted his head, studying her. "Mademoiselle, you say you chatted with Monsieur Gale. Tell me, what did you discuss? And did you notice anything unusual, perhaps a movement, a sound, a glance that seemed out of place?" Jane hesitated, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. "We talked about silly things, really. His dental practice, my work at the salon. He's charming, you know, but I did see something odd." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "There was a man, Mr. Clancy, I think, scribbling in a notebook. He kept muttering to himself, like he was working out a plot. And then, there was that wasp, buzzing about, nearly stung me, but Mr. Gale swatted it away." Poirot's moustache twitched. "A wasp, you say? Most interesting. And where was this wasp when you saw it?" "Near the window, by seat No. 12. It was bothering the Countess, too. She looked awfully cross about it." Japp scribbled in his notebook. "Right, Miss Grey. Anything else? Did you see anyone near Madame Giselle's seat? Anyone acting shifty?" Jane shook her head. "I was too caught up with Mr. Gale. I'm sorry, I wish I'd paid more attention." As Jane was dismissed, Poirot leaned toward Japp. "She is sincere, I think, but her heart is distracted by this dentist. A dangerous thing, love, when it blinds one to murder." Japp snorted. "Love's all well and good, but it doesn't stick a poisoned thorn in someone's neck. Let's have the dentist next." Norman Gale, the man in question, strode into the lounge with the easy confidence of a matinee idol. His dark hair was slicked back, his suit impeccably tailored, and his smile revealed teeth as perfect as one would expect from a dentist. He took a seat, crossing one leg over the other, and met Poirot's gaze with an almost playful glint. "Mr. Gale," Japp began, "you were in seat No. 17, directly across from Miss Grey. Care to tell us what you saw on that flight?" Gale's smile didn't waver. "Not much to tell, Inspector. I was enjoying Miss Grey's company. Lovely girl, by the way. We talked about London, the weather, my practice in Harley Street. I didn't notice Madame Giselle until the steward raised the alarm." Shocking business, really. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Monsieur, you are a dentist. You work with precision, with tools, with substances that can heal or harm. Did you, perhaps, notice anything about the passenger's behavior? A gesture, a movement, something that struck you as unusual? Gale's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, so brief Poirot nearly missed it. Well, now that you mention it, I did see that writer chap Clancy fiddling with something in his bag. Looked like a pen, but he was awfully secretive about it. And the Countess of Horbury was in a right state, kept dabbing her nose with a handkerchief, thought she might have had a cold, but he shrugged, letting the implication hang. Poirot nodded slowly. And the wasp, Monsieur Gale? Mademoiselle Gray mentioned you swatted it away. Where did it go? Gale chuckled. Oh, that pest. I gave it a good whack with my newspaper. Landed in someone's coffee cup, I think. Didn't see it after that. As Gale left, Poirot tapped his pencil against his lips. He is smooth, this dentist. Too smooth, perhaps, but we shall see. The Countess of Horbury was next, and her entrance was nothing short of theatrical. Lady Cicely Horbury swept into the lounge, her fur stole trailing behind her like a royal train. Her platinum blonde hair was styled in perfect waves, but her eyes were bloodshot, and her hands trembled as she lit a cigarette. She sank into the chair, exhaling a plume of smoke that curled toward the ceiling. Really, Inspector? This is absurd, she drawled, her voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. I'm a countess, not some common criminal. I was in seat no. 13, minding my own business, and I didn't know this Giselle woman from Eve. Jap's jaw tightened. Mind telling us what you were doing then, your ladyship, and don't leave out any details about Madame Giselle. Word is, you might have had dealings with her. The Countess's eyes flashed, but she masked it with a laugh. Dealings with a Moneylender? Preposterous. I was reading a magazine, trying to ignore that wretched wasp. It kept buzzing around my seat, positively infuriating. As for the flight, I barely looked at anyone. I was preoccupied. Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but piercing. Preoccupied, Madame? Precisely. And tell me, did you see anyone approach Madame Giselle's seat? Perhaps someone with a curious object in their hand. The Countess's cigarette paused halfway to her lips. I saw nothing of the sort. The stewards were fussing about with trays, and that writer fellow was muttering like a madman. If you must know, I was thinking about my husband. He's difficult. Her voice cracked, and she quickly took a drag to cover it. Poirot noted the tremor in her hand, the way her eyes darted to the side. Difficult husbands and buzzing wasps, he murmured. A most intriguing combination. As the Countess swept out, Jap muttered, she's hiding something. Those debts of hers. Giselle might have had her on a leash. Perhaps, Poirot said, but the leash is not always visible. Let us see what Monsieur Clancy has to offer. Daniel Clancy, the mystery writer, shuffled in, his tweed jacket rumpled, and his glasses perched precariously on his nose. He clutched a battered notebook, its pages bristling with sticky notes. His eyes darted nervously, as if he expected the murderer to leap out from behind the lounge's faded curtains. Mr. Clancy, Jap said, seat no 10, right behind Poirot. As it happens, care to explain what you were scribbling about during the flight? Clancy blinked rapidly. Scribbling? Oh, just ideas for my next novel. A murder on a train. No, a plane. Yes, a plane. Quite topical, don't you think? He gave a nervous laugh, then caught himself. I mean, dreadful business, of course. Poor woman. Poirot's mustache quivered with interest. Monsieur Clancy, you write of murders? Yes. Tell me, have you ever written of a blowpipe, a poisoned dart, perhaps? Clancy's face lit up, his nerves forgotten. Oh, absolutely. In The Crimson Albatross, my detective Wilfred Pigeoncoat solves a case involving a blowpipe in curare. Fascinating weapon, really silent, precise, terribly exotic. I was just jotting down a variation for my new book when it all happened. Jap raised an eyebrow. Convenient, you knowing all about blowpipes. Did you see anyone with one, or anything else suspicious? Clancy hesitated, his fingers drumming on his notebook. Well, I did notice the Duponts, that French father and son. They were whispering about some artifact, sounded awfully intense. And that dentist, Gale, kept leaning over to Miss Gray. But I swear I saw him glance back at Giselle's seat once or twice. Thought it was odd. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Odd, you say? Most useful, Monsieur Clancy. And your notebook, may I see it? Clancy clutched it tighter. It's private, just ideas, you know, nothing to do with this. As Clancy scurried out, Poirot turned to Jap. A man who writes of murder may dream of it, but does he act? I think not. But his eyes, they see more than he admits. The Duponts, Armand and Jean, father and son archaeologists centered together, their faces a study in contrast. Armand, the elder, had a weathered face and a voice like gravel, while Jean's youthful intensity burned through his white glasses. They sat stiffly, their hands clasped, as if guarding a shared secret. Monsieur Poirot began. You were in seats No. 4 and 5, near the victim. You are archaeologists, yes, men of science, of history. Did you know Madame Giselle? Perhaps through her financial dealings. Armand's lips thinned. We knew of her. She funded expeditions, sometimes, but we had no business with her on this flight. We were discussing our latest Finder Sumerian tablet, quite extraordinary. Jean nodded eagerly. It's from your 3rd millennium BC. We were planning its display in London. Giselle's death. It's a tragedy, but we saw nothing. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Nothing. Not the wasp, not a passenger moving strangely, not a sound out of place. Jean flushed. Well, I did hear a sort of puff, like a quick breath. I thought it was the steward opening a bottle, and the wasp was annoying father, buzzing near his coffee. Armand waved a hand. A nuisance, nothing more. We were focused on our work. As the Duponts left, Jap leaned back in his chair. Archaeologists, eh? All that talk of tablets and artifacts sounds like a cover to me. Poirot smiled faintly. Perhaps, mon ami. But the puff of air, that is a clue, I think. Let us speak to the stewards. Henry Mitchell, the senior steward, entered with a weary slump. His uniform was crisp, but his eyes were tired, as if the weight of the murder had settled on his shoulders. I've told you everything, Inspector, he said. I was serving drinks, clearing trays. Didn't see a thing until I found her Madame Giselle. I mean, stone dead. She was. Poirot leaned forward. Monsieur Mitchell, you moved through the cabin, unseen yet seeing all. Tell me, who was near Madame Giselle's seat in the final moments of the flight? And this wasp, where did you see it? Mitchell rubbed his chin. The wasp was by the window, near the Countess and Miss Grey. As for the passengers, I saw Mr. Gale stand up once, said he was stretching his legs, and Mr. Clancy was poking about in his bag, muttering. That's all I noticed. The second steward, Albert Davis, was younger, his face pale and his hands fidgety. I was in the galley most of the time, he said. Didn't see much, but I heard the Countess snap at me when I offered her coffee. She said it was cold. And I saw Mr. Ryder, the businessman, drop his pen, rolled under his seat, right near Madame Giselle. Poirot's eyes lit up. A pen, you say? Most interesting. And where was this pen when you last saw it? Davis shrugged. Didn't think to look. I was busy with the trays. As the stewards departed, Poirot pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket and began sketching a diagram of the Prometheus's rear compartment. Each seat was marked, each passenger's position noted with precision. Jap peered over his shoulder, frowning. What's all this then? You've got something, haven't you? Poirot's pencil paused over the sketch. I have the beginnings. Mon ami, the blowpipe, the wasp, the puff of air, they are pieces of a puzzle. But the picture is not yet clear. The murderer is among these 11, and they have left a trail. Hercule Poirot will find it. He circled the seats one by one. Jane Grey in No. 16. Norman Gale in No. 17. The Countess in No. 13. Clancy in No. 10. The Duponts in Nos. 4 and 5. And the others, James Ryder, the businessman, the quiet Dr. Bryant, and the remaining passengers, each a shadow in the growing mystery. Poirot's little grey cells hummed with possibility, each suspect a thread in the tapestry of murder. Chapter 4. The Wasp's Deception. The air in Croydon Airport's makeshift interrogation room was thick with the scent of stale coffee and nervous sweat. The Prometheus, now grounded, loomed outside the window like a silent witness to the chaos. Within, Hercule Poirot sat at the head of a scratched wooden table, his impeccable mustache twitching as he surveyed the 11 passengers huddled around him. Inspector Jap, his face a map of creases under the strain of the case, paced the room, his boots scuffing the linoleum floor. The discovery of Madame Giselle's body had turned the routine flight into a locked-room mystery at 10,000 feet, and the wasp found dead in a coffee cup was the latest puzzle piece to unsettle the group. Poirot's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, darted from face to face. Jane Grey, the young hairdresser, clutched her handbag, her knuckles white, her gaze flickering nervously toward Norman Gale, the dentist whose easy smile seemed a shade too polished. The Countess of Horbury, draped in a fur stole despite the stuffy room, lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, her lips painted a defiant scarlet. Daniel Clancy, the mystery writer, scribbled furiously in a notebook, muttering about plot twists under his breath. The archaeologists, Armand and Jean Dupont, sat stiffly, their faces unreadable, though Armand's fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the table. The stewards, Henry Mitchell and Albert Davis, stood by the door, their uniforms rumpled, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and unease. James Ryder, the businessman, mopped his brow with a handkerchief, while the quiet Venetia Burnaby, an artist, sketched idly on a napkin, her eyes distant. Dr. Bryant, the ear specialist, adjusted his glasses, and the elderly Miss Kerr, a retired governess, clutched her rosary beads, whispering prayers. Messieurs, E.T. Madame Poirot began, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. We are gathered to unravel a most peculiar crime. Madame Giselle was murdered, not by chance, but by design, and now we have this wasp. He held up a small glass vial containing the insect, its delicate wings stilled forever. A curious detail, n'est-ce pas? But is it the key to our mystery, or a deception? Japp snorted, folding his arms. A wasp, Poirot. You're not suggesting a bug killed her, are you? That thorn in her neck was no insect sting, snake venom, the coroner said. And that blowpipe under your seat, don't tell me a wasp carried that aboard. Poirot's lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. The wasp inspector is not the murderer, but it is a clue, or rather, a lack of one. Tell me, Monsieur Mitchell. He turned to the steward, who straightened abruptly. You saw this wasp during the flight. We describe the moment. Henry Mitchell, a wiry man with a nervous tick in his left eye, cleared his throat. Well, sir, it was about halfway through the flight. I was serving coffee to the rear compartment. Miss Grey, there, she swatted at something near her tray, said it was a wasp. I didn't think much of it, thought it flew off. Then, when we landed and found her, he swallowed, glancing at the empty chair where Giselle had sat. I saw it in her coffee cup, dead. And you, Monsieur Davis? Poirot's gaze shifted to the second steward, a younger man with a mop of sandy hair and a habit of fidgeting with his tie. Albert Davis shrugged, his voice a touch too casual. Didn't see no wasp, sir. I was up front most of the flight, serving the first-class lot. Henry handled the rear. Or, if he says there was a wasp, I believe him. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And yet, Monsieur Davis, you were seen in the rear compartment, delivering a tray to Madame Giselle herself. A tray with a coffee cup, Nan. Davis flushed, his fingers stilling on his tie. Well, yeah, I brought her coffee. Didn't notice any wasp, though. I was in and out quick. The room fell silent, the weight of Poirot's words settling like dust. Jane Grey spoke up, her voice trembling but firm. I did see a wasp. It was buzzing near my seat, and I shooed it away. I thought it was just annoying. Could it really have stung her? Poirot tilted his head, studying her. A natural question, Mademoiselle Grey. But the venom in Madame Giselle's neck was not from a wasp. It was curare, a poison rare and deadly, delivered by that thorn. The wasp, I believe, is a distraction, a clever trick to make us look elsewhere. The Countess of Horbury exhaled a plume of smoke, her voice sharp. A trick? You're saying someone planted a dead wasp to fool us? That's absurd. Why go to all that trouble? Why, indeed? Poirot mused, his fingers steepled. To plant a wasp is to plant doubt, to make us question what we saw or did not see. Let us consider. The blowpipe, found under my seat, is a weapon of precision, yet it was left in plain sight. The wasp, dead in a cup, draws our attention to an insect that cannot sting. Both are theatrical. Now the murderer wishes us to chase shadows. Japp rubbed his temples. Shadows, I've got a dead woman, a blowpipe, and a plane full of suspects. I need facts, not theatrics. Then let us seek facts, Poirot replied, rising from his chair with a grace that belied the tension in the room. Monsieur Mitchell, Monsieur Davis, you will assist us. We shall search the passenger's luggage, every bag, every case, every pocket. If the blowpipe was brought aboard, there may be traces of its origin or of the venom. The stewards nodded. The though Davis's eyes darted nervously toward the door. The passengers were led to a cordoned-off area of the airport, where their luggage awaited inspection. The scene was a flurry of activity. Suitcases snapped open, contents spilled onto tables, and Jap's men rifled through silk scarves, shaving kits, and leather-bound notebooks. Poirot moved among them, his small frame weaving through the chaos, his eyes missing nothing. Jane Grey's suitcase revealed a modest collection of hairdressing tools and a dog-eared romance novel. Norman Gale's held dental instruments, meticulously arranged, though Poirot lingered over a small metal case, its lock unusually sturdy. The Countess of Horbury's bag was a treasure trove of extravagance perfume bottles, jeweled compacts, and a hidden vial of white powder that Jap pocketed with a grim nod. Daniel Clancy's suitcase contained a typewriter and a stack of manuscripts, one titled The Dart of Death, which earned a raised eyebrow from Poirot. The Dupont's bags held archaeological tools and a curious clay tablet inscribed with cuneiform, while James Ryder's briefcase bulged with financial ledgers, some pages hastily torn. Venetia Burnaby's sketchbook was filled with haunting charcoal drawings of faces, one resembling Giselle. Dr. Bryant's medical bag contained syringes and vials, none labeled as poison, and Miss Kerr's purse held only a prayer book and a faded photograph of a young girl. But it was in Madame Giselle's own handbag, retrieved from the plane, that Poirot found the most intriguing clue. Tucked inside a velvet pouch was a folded note, written in a hurried scrawl: "The debt must be paid, or the truth flies free." No signature, no address, but the ink was fresh, the paper crisp. Poirot held it to the light, his mind racing blackmail. He murmured to Jap, who leaned over his shoulder. Madame Giselle was not merely a motley lender. She traded in secrets, and someone on this flight feared her knowledge. Jap's eyes widened. "You think the killer was one of her clients? Someone she was squeezing?" "Precisement," Poirot said, "but the note is not enough. We must understand the wasp. Why place it in the cup? Why not let the blowpipe alone speak of the crime?" He turned to the stewards, who were stacking the searched luggage. "Monsieur Mitchell, tell me again, when you found the wasp, was the coffee cup empty, save for the insect?" Mitchell frowned, scratching his head. "Well, sir, there was a bit of coffee left. Not much, just a splash. The wasp was floating in it." "And the cup was Madame Giselle's?" Poirot pressed. "Yes, sir. Her tray was still out when we found her. Cup, saucer, all there." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And you, Monsieur Davis, you brought her that coffee. Did you see her drink it?" Davis hesitated, his fingers tugging at his tie again. I don't recall, sir. She took the tray, and I moved on. Didn't see her drink." Poirot's smile was tight, almost predatory. "Merci, Monsieur Davis. You have been most illuminating." As the passengers were escorted back to the interrogation room, Poirot lingered by the luggage, his fingers brushing the handle of Norman Gale's metal case. He tapped it lightly, listening to the faint echo within. "Inspector," he called, softly, "this case, it is locked. I suggest we open it." Jap, ever practical, summoned a constable with a set of lockpick. The case sprang open, revealing rows of dental tools, a small mirror, and a peculiar item, a hollowed-out pen, its barrel wide enough to conceal a slender dart. Poirot lifted it carefully, his eyes gleaming. "Not a blowpipe," he said, "but a disguise." The blowpipe was too obvious, too crude. This is the work of a mind that plans." Jap stared, incredulous. "You're saying Gale hid the dart in a pen, but why leave the blowpipe under your seat?" "To mislead," Poirot said simply. "The blowpipe is a stage prop, meant to draw our eyes. The real weapon was small, discreet, and carried openly. But we are not yet certain of Monsieur Gale's guilt. We must observe, we must think." The passengers reconvened, their faces a mix of indignation and fear. The Countess of Horbury lit another cigarette, her hands steadier now, as if defiance had replaced her earlier nerves. Daniel Clancy muttered about red herrings in detective fiction, earning a sharp glance from Poirot. Jane Grey sat beside Norman Gale, her shoulder brushing his, though her eyes held a flicker of doubt. The Duponts whispered in French, "There," voices low, while James Ryder complained loudly about the delay to his business meetings. Poirot stood, his presence commanding silence. "Mies Amos, the wasp is no accident. It was placed to confuse, to make us believe in a simple explanation, a sting, a natural death. But Madame Giselle was killed with precision, with intent. The clue lies not in what we see, but in what we did not see. During the flight, who moved, who acted when all eyes were elsewhere? The room buzzed with unease. Jane Grey raised her hand hesitantly. I stood up once, to stretch my legs. I didn't see anything unusual though. And I, Norman Gale added smoothly, went to the lavatory, nothing out of the ordinary. Poirot's eyes lingered on Gale, unblinking. Mercy, Monsieur Gale, your candor is noted. As the group dispersed, Japp pulled Poirot aside. You're onto something, aren't you? That pen, the wasp, the notewots, the connection. Poirot's voice was low, almost a whisper. The connection, my friend, is misdirection. The wasp was not a mistake. It was a signal, a flourish by a killer who enjoys the game. But I, Hercule Poirot, do not chase shadows. I chase truth. And the truth is here, in this room, hiding behind a smile. Chapter 5. Shadows of Blackmail. The Parisian morning was crisp, the air laced with the faint scent of rain and the hum of a city stirring to life. Hercule Poirot stepped out of his hotel on the Rue de Rivoli, his polished shoes clicking against the cobblestones, his moustache impeccably twirled despite the early hour. The journey from London had been swift, but his mind was already heavy with the weight of the mystery aboard the Prometheus. Madame Giselle's murder, executed with such audacious precision in the confines of an airliner, gnawed at his little grey cells. The blowpipe, the venom-laced thorn, the wasp each was a piece of a puzzle. But the picture remained maddeningly incomplete. Poirot adjusted his hat, a sleek Homburg that shielded his eyes from the morning glare, and glanced at his companion, Inspector Fournier of the Street. Fournier, a wiry man with a sharp nose and a penchant for dramatic gestures, was already gesturing animatedly toward a waiting taxi. Monsieur Poirot, he said, his voice tinged with a mix of respect and impatience, you are certain this visit to Elise Grandier will yield something? The maid of a moneylender, surely she knows little of value. Poirot's lips curled into a faint, enigmatic smile. Mon ami, it is often in the shadows of the powerful that the truth hides. Elise Grandier served Madame Giselle for years. If anyone knows the secrets behind the moneylender's empire, it is she. The taxi wove through Paris's labyrinthian streets, past boulangeries, wafting the aroma of fresh croissants, and cafes where intellectuals argued over espresso. Poirot's mind, however, was elsewhere, reconstructing the rear compartment of the Prometheus. 11 passengers, each a potential killer, each with a secret Madame Giselle might have exploited. The Countess of Horbury's debts, whispered to be ruinous. James Ryder's faltering business ventures, the Dupont's obsessive pursuit of ancient artifacts. Any could have driven a desperate hand to wield that exotic blowpipe. But why such a weapon? Why not a knife, a poison in a drink, something less theatrical? They arrived at a modest apartment building in the 11th arrondissement, its facade weathered but dignified. Elise Grandier's flat was on the 3rd floor, reached by a creaking staircase that seemed to groan under the weight of secrets. Fournier knocked, and the door opened to reveal a woman in her late 40s, her face lined with the quiet resilience of one who had seen much but spoken little. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her eyes, sharp and wary, flicked from Fournier to Poirot. Madame Grandier, Poirot began, his voice smooth as velvet. I am Hercule Poirot. This is Inspector Fournier. We come regarding the tragic death of your employer. Madame Giselle. Release's expression tightened, but she stepped aside, gesturing them into a small, tidy parlor. I heard, she said, her voice low, accented with the cadence of rural France, a terrible thing, but I don't see how I can help. I was her maid, not her confidant. Poirot settled into a worn armchair, his posture impeccable, his eyes never leaving Elise's face. Yet you lived in her home, handled her correspondence, perhaps overheard things others did not. Madame Giselle was no ordinary n'est-ce pas? She dealt in secrets as much as in gold. Elise's hands, clasped tightly in her lap, twitched. She was discreet. Her clients valued that. I cleaned her house, prepared her meals. I didn't pry. Fournier snorted, pacing the room like a restless cat. Come now, madame. A woman like Giselle, with her fingers in the pockets of half the aristocracy, must have left traces, letters, ledgers, something. Poirot raised a hand, silencing Fournier's outburst. Permit me, Inspector. He leaned forward, his voice softening, almost conspiratorial. Madame Grandier, I do not believe you are a woman who misses much. A maid sees everything: the late-night visitors, the sealed envelopes, the whispered arguments. Tell me, did Madame Giselle ever speak of her clients on the Prometheus flight? A countess, perhaps, or a businessman in distress? Elise hesitated, her gaze darting to the window, as if expecting an eavesdropper. Finally, she spoke, her words measured. She mentioned a countess once, a woman who owed more than she could pay, who begged for time. Giselle laughed about it. She said the woman's title was worth less than the paper it was written on. The Countess of Hercule Poirot, murmured, his mind conjuring the image of the elegant but jittery woman in seat No. 13, her eyes shadowed by more than fatigue. And others, a dentist, a writer, archaeologists. Elise shook her head. She didn't name names, not directly, but there was a book, a ledger, locked in her safe. She called it her insurance, said it held the truth about her clients, things that could ruin them. She never let me see it, but I heard her muttering once, something about the man who plays the gentleman. Poirot's eyes gleamed. The man who plays the gentleman, most interesting. And where is this ledger now? Elise's lips pressed into a thin line. Gone. After the police came to her house, I checked. The safe was empty. Fournier swore under his breath, but Poirot merely nodded, as if this confirmed a suspicion. Merci, Madame Dear, you have been most helpful. As they descended the creaking stairs, Fournier's frustration boiled over. Helpful. She gave us nothing but vague hints. A missing ledger, a countess we already suspected. Where does this get us? Poirot paused on the landing, his gloved hand resting lightly on the banister. It gets us closer, mon ami. The ledger's absence is as telling as its contents would have been. Someone took it, someone who knew its value. And this man who plays the gentleman, it is a clue, a thread to pull. The taxi ride back to central Paris was quiet. Poirot lost in thought, his fingers tapping a rhythm on his cane. The ledger, he reasoned, was the key to Giselle's power. Blackmail was a dangerous game, one that invited deadly retribution. But the blowpipe, why choose such a weapon? Its origins pointed to South America, a continent far removed from the polished salons of Paris or the foggy streets of London. The Duponts, with their archaeological pursuits, might know of such tools, but their demeanor suggested passion for relics, not murder. Norman Gale, the dentist, had the precision for such a strike, yet his charm seemed too polished, too deliberate. And Daniel Clancy, the mystery writer, could his tales of fictional poisons mask a real killer's cunning? Back in London, Inspector Japp was waiting at Scotland Yard, his office cluttered with files and cigarette stubs. Poirot, he bellowed, waving a sheaf of papers. I've been digging into Giselle's finances, and it's a bloody mess. The Countess of Hercule's up to her neck in debt. Giselle was squeezing her for thousands. James Ryder's no better. His company's on the brink, and he was late on payments to her. Even the Duponts had a loan, though it's smaller, tied to some dig in Persia. Poirot perched on the edge of a chair, his eyes scanning the documents. Japp spread before him, and Norman Gale, the dentist with the charming smile. Japp grunted. Clean, on the surface, pays his bills, runs a tidy practice. But there's a gap, a withdrawal of £1,000 last month. No clear reason. Why? Could be nothing, could be something. Poirot's fingers drummed lightly on the desk. £1,000. Not an insignificant sum. And Daniel Clancy, odd duck, Japp said, lighting a cigarette. His books sell well enough, but he's got no head for money. Giselle lent him a few hundred last year, and he's still paying it off. Nothing major, but he was on that flight, and he's got a mind for plots. Poirot leaned back, his eyes half closed. A mind for plots, a dentist with a secret, a countess with debts, archaeologists with knowledge of exotic poisons. And yet, the blowpipe, it is incongruous. A weapon of the jungle, used in the sky. Why? Japp shrugged. To throw us off, maybe. Make it look like some tribal nonsense. Perhaps, Poirot said, but his tone was unconvinced. But the killer chose it for a reason. It required skill, precision, and nerve to use it in a crowded cabin without being seen. We must consider the how as much as the why. That afternoon Poirot returned to Croydon Airport, where the Prometheus stood silent, its silver fuselage gleaming under a weak sun. With Japp's reluctant permission, he boarded the airliner, now empty save for a lone mechanic tinkering with the engine. Poirot moved to the rear compartment, his eyes tracing the rows of seats. Seat No. 9 his own. Seat No. 12. Madame Giselle's. The blowpipe had been found beneath his seat, a detail that still rankled. Was it planted to implicate him, or was it simply the killer's hasty disposal? He sat in his seat, closing his eyes to recreate the flight in his mind. The hum of the engines, the clink of coffee cups, the rustle of newspapers, the stewards, Henry Mitchell and Albert Davis, moving up and down the aisle. The Wasp, buzzing, annoyingly near Jane Grey's seat. Jane herself, blushing as she spoke to Norman Gale. The Countess of Horbury, powdering her nose with a trembling hand. Daniel Clancy, scribbling in a notebook. The Duponts' heads bent over a map, and Madame Giselle, silent, her head tilted as if asleep until she wasn't. Poirot stood abruptly, his eyes snapping open. He moved to the rear of the cabin, where a small storage area held spare cushions and blankets. Kneeling, a rare act, for the fastidious detective, he examined the floor, the walls, the crevices. Nothing. But as he rose, his gaze fell on the window beside Giselle's seat. A tiny scratch, barely visible, marred the glass. He traced it with a gloved finger, his mind racing. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. "It is possible, but audacious." Back at his hotel, Poirot devised an experiment. He enlisted the help of a reluctant Jap and a bemused airport steward. Borrowing a replica of the Prometheus's rear compartment used for crew training, with a wooden blowpipe procured from a theatrical supplier, to Jap's amusement, Poirot tested its mechanics. He stood at various points in the mock cabin, aiming at a dummy in Giselle's seat. The blowpipe was light, easily concealed in a sleeve or bag, but its use required a clear line of sight and a steady hand. In the cramped, swaying cabin, with passengers and stewards moving about, it seemed nearly impossible. Yet Poirot persisted, adjusting his stance, timing his movements to mimic the steward's routines. After an hour, he lowered the blowpipe, his face troubled. "It could be done," he said to Jap, who was nursing a headache from the tedious exercise, "but only by someone who knew the cabin's rhythm, the steward's patterns, the passengers' distractions." The killer was not impulsive. They planned this with care. Jap rubbed his temples. "So we're looking for someone clever.com, and with a reason to want Giselle dead. That's half the bloody plane." Poirot's smile was faint but sharp. "Nan, Inspector, it is one person. One who sat within reach, who knew Giselle's secrets, and who dared to strike in the sky. We must look closer at their masks, the charming, the desperate, the distracted. One of them is a lie." As night fell over London, Poirot sat at his desk, a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. He spread his notes before him, the seating chart, the passenger profiles, Elise Grandier's cryptic words, the man who plays the gentleman, the missing ledger, the blowpipe's exotic origins. Each was a thread, weaving toward a truth he could almost grasp, but the final piece, the why of the blowpipe, eluded him. It was a taunt, a signature, a deliberate choice by a mind that reveled in its own cleverness. He closed his eyes, letting the silence settle. Tomorrow, he would return to the suspects, probe their facades, test their alibis. The Prometheus had carried a killer, and Hercule Poirot would not rest until the shadows of blackmail revealed their face. Chapter 6. The inquest's drama. The Croydon Coroner's Court was a dour, grey-bricked building, its squat facade squatting beneath a leaden English sky. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and nervous anticipation, a peculiar blend of formality and barely suppressed chaos. Hercule Poirot sat in the third row, his polished shoes gleaming under the dim fluorescent lights, his gloved hands folded neatly over the handle of his walking stick. His moustache twitched, a subtle sign of his discomfort not at the proceedings, but at the faint whiff of stale coffee lingering from a nearby thermos. The room buzzed with reporters, their pencils scratching like eager insects, weaving tales of scandal and intrigue around the death of Madame Giselle aboard the airliner Prometheus. The inquest had become a spectacle, and Poirot, though loath to admit it, was its reluctant star. The coroner, Mr. Harold Winthrop, was a wiry man with a perpetually furrowed brow, as if life had handed him one too many unsolvable puzzles. He adjusted his spectacles and called the room to order, his voice sharp enough to slice through the murmurs. "We are here to determine the cause and circumstances of the death of Marie Morisot, known as Madame Giselle, on board the Prometheus flight from Paris to Croydon on the 17th of September. Let us proceed with precision and respect." Poirot's eyes scanned the room, cataloguing the faces of the passengers from that fateful flight. each seated in a tense tableau. Jane Grey, the young hairdresser, sat near the front, her auburn curls tucked neatly under a modest hat, her fingers twisting a handkerchief into knots. Beside her, Norman Gale, the dentist, maintained a polished composure, his smile a touch too bright, like a man who had practiced it in a mirror. The Countess of Horbury, Cicely, lounged in a pew across the aisle, her fur stole slipping artfully off one shoulder, her eyes darting to the reporters with a mix of disdain and calculation. Daniel Clancy, the mystery writer, scribbled furiously in a notebook, his tweed jacket rumpled as if he'd slept in it. The archaeologists, Armand and Jean Dupont, sat stiffly, their faces unreadable, while James Ryder, the businessman, fidgeted with his tie, his florid cheeks betraying a sleepless night. The proceedings began with the medical evidence, delivered by Dr. Ernest Pritchard, a gaunt pathologist with a voice like dry leaves. The deceased, Madame Giselle, succumbed to a lethal dose of hydrocyanic acid, likely delivered via a thorn-like projectile embedded in her neck. Death was instantaneous, occurring between 12:30 and 1 p.m. during the flight. A ripple of gasps swept the room, and Poirot's lips pursed. Hydrocyanic acid swift, silent, and merciless. His mind flickered to the blowpipe found beneath his seat, an exotic anomaly in the sterile modernity of the Prometheus. Why such a weapon? The question gnawed at him, a splinter in his orderly thoughts. The coroner called Henry Mitchell, the senior steward, to the stand. Mitchell, a lanky man with a nervous tic in his left eye, recounted his routine aboard the flight. "I served coffee and biscuits, sir, and noticed nothing unusual until I found Madame Giselle slumped in her seat. I thought she was asleep at first, but then I saw, well, she wasn't breathing." "Did you observe anything else?" Winthrop pressed. "Any odd behavior among the passengers?" Mitchell hesitated, his eyes flicking to Poirot, who sat impassive. "There was a wasp, sir, buzzing about the cabin. Annoyed a few people, especially Miss Grey. I swatted it away, but it kept coming back." Poirot's moustache twitched again. The wasp a clumsy distraction, he was certain, but its persistence in the narrative intrigued him. Was it mere coincidence, or had someone ensured its presence was noted? Next came Albert Davis, the junior steward, a ruddy-faced young man, seemed overwhelmed by the courtroom scrutiny. "I was serving drinks from the front, sir. Didn't see much in the back where Madame Giselle was, but I did notice Mr. Gale, Dr. Gale, that is adjusting his bag under his seat. Looked like he was checking something." Poirot's gaze sharpened, locking onto Norman Gale, who maintained his easy smile, but shifted slightly in his seat. A bag under the seat, a blowpipe under Poirot's own. The pieces of the puzzle were tantalizingly close, yet maddeningly incomplete. The coroner turned to the passengers, and the room tensed as Jane Grey took the stand. Her voice was soft but steady, her eyes avoiding Gale's. "I was in seat 12, near the aisle. I saw Madame Giselle earlier in the flight. She seemed fine, just reading a ledger. Then the wasp kept bothering me, and I didn't notice anything else until the steward shouted, 'Did you see anyone approach Madame Giselle?' Winthrop asked. Jane shook her head, her cheeks flushing. "No, sir, I was distracted, talking to Dr. Gale." Poirot noted the hesitation, the faint tremor in her voice. Jane was no liar, but she was holding something back, perhaps not about the murder, but about her heart. Her glances at Gale carried the weight of unspoken affection, and Poirot wondered if it clouded her perception. The Countess of Horbury followed, her testimony a performance. She tossed her blonde curls and spoke with a practiced drawl. "I barely knew the woman. She was just another passenger, darling. I was far too busy with my own thoughts to notice anything." Her eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of fear when the coroner mentioned Giselle's profession as a moneylender. Poirot leaned forward, his fingers tightening on his stick. The Countess's debts to Giselle were no secret. Thanks to Japp's inquiries, her nonchalance was a mask, and a flimsy one at that. Then came the shock. The coroner, prompted by a juror's whispered question, turned to Poirot himself. "Monsieur Poirot, you were seated directly in front of the deceased, and the blowpipe was found beneath your seat. Can you explain this?" The room fell silent, pencils poised, eyes swiveling to the diminutive detective. Poirot rose, his movements deliberate, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Monsieur, I am Hercule Poirot, a detective of some repute, not a suspect in need of explanation. The blowpipe was placed under my seat to cast suspicion, a crude attempt at misdirection. I observed nothing of the murder itself, for I was, regrettably, battling the malaise of air travel. But I assure you, the truth lies not in where the blow was found, but in who had the opportunity to use it. A murmur of astonishment rippled through the crowd. The coroner flushed, clearly unprepared for Poirot's commanding presence. "Very well, Monsieur Poirot, we appreciate your clarity." Poirot sat, his expression serene, but his mind raced. The accusation, however fleeting, was a calculated move, perhaps not by the jury, but by someone who knew the blowpipe's placement would point to him. The killer was clever, weaving a web of doubt to entangle the unwary. Norman Gale's testimony followed, and Poirot listened with heightened attention. Gale's voice was smooth, his manner polished. "I'm a dentist, sir, not a poisoner. I was chatting with Miss Grey most of the flight, and I only left my seat once to fetch a book from my bag. I saw nothing suspicious." "Yet the steward noted you adjusting your bag," Winthrop said, his tone skeptical. Gale's smile didn't waver. "Just making sure my dental tools were secure. They're delicate, you know." Poirot's eyes narrowed. Dental tools. Could be disguised as one. Perhaps, its slender form tucked among scalpels and probes. Gale's alibi was too perfect, too rehearsed. Like a line from one of Daniel Clancy's novels, the inquest dragged on, with Daniel Clancy offering a rambling account of his writing process, claiming he'd been lost in thought about a fictional murder. The DuPonts spoke briefly, their French accents thick, their answers vague about their archaeological work. James Ryder admitted to a business dispute with Giselle, but swore it was resolved. Each testimony added layers to the mystery, but none cracked it open. As the coroner adjourned for deliberation, Poirot slipped outside, the cool air a relief after the courtroom's stuffiness. Jane Grey followed, her face pale but determined. "Monsieur Poirot, I want to help. I know I'm not a detective, but I see things about people. I'm a hairdresser, after all. People talk to me." Poirot studied her, noting the earnestness in her hazel eyes. "Mademoiselle, your offer is most generous. The heart of this case lies in observation, and you may see what others miss. Tell me, what do you make of Dr. Gale?" Jane hesitated, her cheeks coloring. "He's charming, kind, but sometimes, when he thinks no one's watching, his smile fades, and he looks worried, like he's carrying something heavy." Poirot nodded, his mind filing away her words. "Very well, mademoiselle, observe, but do not confront. The killer is among us, and they are dangerous." The jury returned with an open verdict: murder by person or persons unknown. The reporters swarmed, spinning tales of the airliner assassin, but Poirot ignored them, his thoughts elsewhere. As he walked away from the courthouse, Jane at his side, he felt the weight of the case settling into his bones. The blowpipe, the wasp, the venomable pieces of a puzzle designed to deceive. But Hercule Poirot was not easily deceived. He paused, glancing at Jane. "Mademoiselle, you have a good heart, but beware. Love can blind us to truth." Jane's lips parted, but she said nothing, her eyes searching his. Poirot smiled faintly, sensing her innocence but wary of her entanglement with Gale. The sky above Croydon was clearing, but the mystery remained shrouded. The killer was close to Closand. Poirot's little grey cells were already weaving a net to catch them. The narrative unfolded over the next few days, with Poirot and Jane forming an unlikely alliance. Their conversations, often held over tea at a quaint Croydon café, revealed Jane's knack for noticing details: how the Countess's hands trembled when she mentioned Giselle, or how Daniel Clancy's notebook was filled with sketches of blowpipes, not just words. Poirot, in turn, shared snippets of his method, teaching Jane to look beyond the obvious, to see the patterns beneath the surface. One afternoon, as they strolled through a park, Jane recounted a memory from the flight. "There was a moment, Monsieur Poirot, when I saw Mr. Clancy drop his pen. He bent down to pick it up, and his sleeve caught on his bag. It looked bulky, like something long was inside." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A flute case, perhaps, or something more sinister." Jane frowned. "I don't know, but it stuck with me." Their investigation took a turn when Jap, ever the dogged policeman, arrived with news. "We've traced the blowpipe's origin, Poirot. It's South American, likely smuggled through a dealer in Paris. And there's more Gezels made mentioned a woman claiming to be her daughter, Anne Morisot, who showed up in Paris right after the murder." Poirot's mustache quivered with interest. "A daughter. or an impostor. We must find her, Jap. The search for Anne Morisot led them to a boarding house in London, but the trail was cold. She'd vanished, leaving only a single glove behind, monogrammed with an A. Poirot held the glove, his mind racing. Was Anne a victim, caught in her mother's web of blackmail, or a player in the game, orchestrating her own escape? As the days passed, Poirot's suspicions circled back to Norman Gale. The dentist's charm was a veneer, and Jane's observations confirmed it. His eyes, she said, were too still, like a lake hiding something beneath. Poirot arranged to visit Gale's dental practice, posing as a patient. The office was pristine, the tools gleaming, but Poirot's keen eye spotted a locked drawer in Gale's desk, its key tucked in a hidden compartment. Inside, he found a vial of clear liquid, unlabeled but suspicious. "Careless," Poirot murmured, slipping the vial into his pocket. The guilty are often betrayed by their own precision. The chapter's climax came at a second meeting with the passengers, orchestrated by Poirot at a private club in London. He gathered them under the pretense of clarifying their statements, but his true aim was to provoke. He spoke of the blowpipe, the venom, and the wasp. Watching their faces, the Countess flinched at the mention of debts. Clancy's pen froze mid-scribble, and Gale's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Monsieur Gale," Poirot said, his voice soft but piercing, "your tools are most versatile. A dentist's precision could, perhaps, deliver a thorn with deadly accuracy." Gale laughed, but it was hollow. "You're reaching, Monsieur Poirot. I'm just a dentist, not a murderer." The room held its breath, but Poirot let the moment pass, his eyes promising more to come. As the passengers dispersed, Jane whispered, "Did you see how he gripped his chair? He's scared." Poirot nodded. "Fear, mademoiselle, is the shadow of guilt. We are close." Chapter 7. Parisian Connections. The air in Paris carried a crisp edge, the kind that sharpened the senses and made every cobblestone underfoot feel like a step toward revelation. Hercule Poirot, his overcoat buttoned against the late afternoon chill, stood outside a modest yet elegant townhouse in the Marais district. The building, with its wrought iron balcony and ivy clinging to the stone facade, belonged to the late Madame Giselle, a woman whose secrets had outlived her body, now cold in a Croydon morgue. Beside Poirot stood Inspector Fournier of the street, a wiry man with a perpetually furrowed brow, as if life itself were a puzzle he was doomed to solve incorrectly. "Her home, Monsieur Poirot," Fournier said, gesturing to the door. His voice held a trace of reverence, not for Giselle but for the enigma she represented. "Elise Grandier, her maid, awaits us. She is distraught, but cooperative." Poirot's mustache twitched, a subtle sign of his mind already at work. Distraught, yet cooperative. A curious combination. Nan, let us see what truths lie behind her tears. The door creaked open, revealing Elise Grandier, a woman in her late 40s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes red-rimmed, but steady. Her black dress, simple yet meticulously pressed, spoke of a servant's pride in her role. She led them into a parlor where heavy drapes muted the daylight, casting long shadows across a mahogany desk cluttered with papers. The air smelled faintly of lavender and wax, a scent that clung to the past. "Messieurs," Elise began, her voice low but firm. "I knew this day would come. Madame's work, it was not without danger." Poirot settled into a velvet chair, his hands folded over his cane. "Mademoiselle Grandier, you speak of danger. Tell me, what was the nature of Madame Giselle's work, beyond the lending of money?" Elise hesitated, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. "She was a yes, but also a keeper of secrets. Her clients were not just debtors. They were men and women of influence, lords, ladies, politicians who owed her more than money. They owed her their reputations." Fournier's brow furrowed deeper. "Blackmail." Then Elise flinched at the word but did not deny it. She called it leverage. She had a book, a ledger, hidden somewhere in this house. It named names, dates, sins. She said it was her insurance. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And this ledger, mademoiselle, where is it now?" Elise shook her head. "I don't know. She moved it often. Sometimes in the safe, sometimes elsewhere. She trusted no one, not even me." The room fell silent, save for the distant chime of a clock. Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but piercing. "And yet, mademoiselle, you were her confidant. Did she ever speak of a client who might wish her harm? Someone on the Prometheus, perhaps?" Elise's gaze darted to the window, as if expecting a shadow to move. She mentioned a name, Horbury, a woman, a countess. Madame said she was desperate, drowning in debts, and something worse. But there were others. A man, a professional. She called him the Smiling One. She laughed when she spoke of him. But her laugh was not kind. Poirot's mind raced. The Countess of Horbury, with her nervous elegance and cocaine-tinted eyes, was already a suspect. But the Smiling One, that could be Norman Gale, the dentist with the too-perfect charm. Or perhaps Daniel Clancy, whose distracted air masked a sharp mind. Or someone else entirely. Mademoiselle Poirot said, rising, "We must find this ledger. With your permission, we will search." Elise nodded, her face pale but resolute. "Do what you must." The search was meticulous, as Poirot demanded. Fournier, less patient, rifled through drawers while Poirot examined the room with the precision of a watchmaker. He tapped walls, lifted rugs, and peered behind paintings, his gloved fingers tracing seams and edges. At last, beneath a loose floorboard under Giselle's desk, he found it, a slim, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with coded entries. Names were disguised as initials, amounts listed in cryptic shorthand, and beside each a single word or phrase: adultery, fraud, betrayal. "This," Poirot said, holding the ledger aloft, "is the map of a murderer's motive." Squinted at the pages. "It's gibberish. How do you propose we decode it?" Poirot smiled faintly. "With time, mon ami, and the little grey cells. But first, we return to London. There is another thread to pull." Back in London, the air was heavier, thick with fog and the clamour of Fleet Street reporters hungry for the next twist in the Prometheus murder. Inspector Japp, his coat rumpled and his mood fouler than usual, met Poirot at Scotland Yard. The detective's office was a chaos of files and cigarette stubs, a stark contrast to Poirot's orderly mind. "You've got that look, Poirot," Japp grumbled, tossing a folder onto his desk. "What did you find in Paris?" Poirot set the ledger down with a flourish. "A treasure, Inspector, a record of secrets that Madame Giselle wielded like a blade. But I have more. Tell me, what have you learned of our friend Daniel Clancy?" Japp's eyes narrowed. "The writer, odd duck. His novels are full of bizarre murders, poisoned darts, strangling scarves, the lot. One of his books, The Crimson Thorn, has a murder by blowpipe, almost identical to our case. Too close for coincidence, if you ask me." Poirot's mustache twitched. "And yet, coincidence is the cloak of the clever. Clancy's imagination may be his alibi, or his confession. We must watch him closely." Japp leaned back, lighting a cigarette. "There's more. We've got a new player. Anne Morizot, claiming to be Giselle's daughter, showed up from Canada this morning. Says she's here to claim her mother's estate. But here's the rub: she's vanished. Checked into a hotel in Bloomsbury, then poof, gone by noon." Poirot's eyes widened. A rare flicker of surprise. "Vanished. This is most interesting. Describe her, if you please." Japp shrugged. Mid-30s, dark hair, quiet, looked nervous, according to the hotel clerk. Left a suitcase, but it's empty except for some clothes and a photograph of Giselle. Poirot paced, his cane tapping rhythmically. A daughter, or an impostor, and why vanish so soon? "We must find her, Japp. She may be a victim, or a vulture circling the spoils." The trail of Anne Morizot led Poirot and Japp to a dingy café in Soho, where the hotel clerk had overheard her mention a meeting. The café, with its chipped teacups and smoke-stained walls, was a haven for those who wished to disappear. The owner, a grizzled man named Tompkins, remembered Anne vividly. "She was here yesterday," Tompkins said, wiping a glass with a rag that looked dirtier than the glass itself. "Sat in the corner, kept checking her watch. A man joined her, fair-haired, wore a fancy suit. They argued, quiet-like, but I caught a few words. Something about debts and proof. She left in a hurry, and he followed." Poirot's mind-word, fair-haired, well-dressed. Norman Gale fit the description, but so could others. This man, did he have a name? Tompkins shook his head. Didn't hear one, but he had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Gave me the creeps." Poirot exchanged a glance with Japp. "The Smiling One," he murmured. "We must trace this meeting, and we must find Mademoiselle Morizot before she becomes another victim." The search for Anne took them to a boarding house in Camden, where a neighbour claimed to have seen a woman matching her description. The house was a crumbling relic, its halls smelling of damp and regret. The landlady, Mrs. Henshaw, a woman with a face like a weathered gargoyle, confirmed Anne had rented a room under the name Marie Dubois, but hadn't been seen since the previous night. Left her things, though, Mrs. Henshaw said, leading them to a cramped room. Inside, Poirot found a small notebook tucked beneath a mattress. Its pages were filled with hurried scrawls, dates, amounts, and a single name repeated. Gale. Norman Gale, Poirot said, his voice low. The dentist with the charming smile. He's no longer a shadow in this case. Japp frowned. You think he's our man? Poirot closed the notebook. I think, mon ami, that he is a piece of the puzzle. But the picture is not yet complete. We must return to the Prometheus, to the moment of the crime. The answer lies in the air, where no one could hide, and yet someone did. The next morning, Poirot stood on the tarmac at Croydon Airport, staring at the Prometheus airliner, now grounded and silent. The plane's sleek lines and polished fuselage seemed almost mocking, as if it held the secret to Giselle's death in its rivets and seams. Fournier had joined him, along with a reluctant Japp, who muttered about the cold. Why are we here? Poirot, Japp asked, stamping his feet. The plane's been searched top to bottom. Poirot's eyes traced the cabin windows. Because, Inspector, the plane is the stage, and the murder was a performance. The blowpipe, the wasp, the thorn, these are props, carefully chosen. But the killer forgot one thing: the audience. Me. Fournier raised an eyebrow. You think you saw something you didn't realize? Poirot nodded. Exactement. During the flight, I was distracted by my mal de l'air, but my eyes, they see even when my stomach protests. There was a moment, a flicker of movement, perhaps, or a glance that lingered too long. I must recreate it. He boarded the plane, moving to seat No. 9, where he had sat during the fatal flight. The cabin felt smaller now, the seats closer, the air thick with the memory of death. Poirot closed his eyes, picturing the passengers. Jane Grey's shy smiles, the Countess's fidgeting, Norman Gale's polished grin, Daniel Clancy's distracted scribbling, and then, a memory: Sir Steward Henry Mitchell, pausing by Giselle's seat, his tray trembling slightly. Mitchell, Poirot murmured. He served the drinks. He was close to her, unnoticed, as stewards often are. Japp snorted. You're not suggesting the steward's our man? He's got no motive. Poirot's eyes opened, sharp and bright. Motive, Inspector, is like a shadow. It shifts with the light. We must look again at the ledger, at the names, and we must find Anne Morisot. She is the key, or the lock, to this mystery. The ledger, back at Scotland Yard, yielded its secrets slowly. Poirot spent hours cross-referencing initials with passenger names, his pencil moving in precise strokes. One entry stood out: NG debt, 10,000 francs, secret, falsified records. Norman Gale, the dentist, had more than charm to hide. Another entry, less clear, mentioned A.M. Anne Morisot, and a sum of money marked inheritance. Giselle, daughter, Poirot said, leaning back in his chair. If Anne is truly her heir, she may know the ledger's code, or she may be running from it. Fournier, who had been poring over police reports, looked up. There's something else. A report from Canada, about Anne Morisot. She's no stranger to trouble, arrested 2 years ago for fraud, though the charges were dropped. Could she be playing a deeper game? Poirot's fingers drummed on the desk. A daughter, a fraudster, a fugitive. And yet, she comes to London, only to vanish. Why? To claim her mother's wealth, or to silence her mother's secrets? The day ended with a lead, a telegram from a Paris informant, claiming Anne had been spotted at a small hotel near the Gare du Nord. Poirot and Fournier prepared to return to Paris, while Japp coordinated a search in London. As Poirot packed his valise, he paused, staring at a small object on his hotel room desk, a single thorn, identical to the one that killed Giselle, sent to him anonymously with a note. The truth stings. He turned the thorn in his fingers, its tip glinting in the lamplight. The killer is bold, he said to himself, but boldness betrays. I am coming for you, mon ami. Chapter 8. The Art of Misdirection. The London evening was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked cobblestones, the kind of damp chill that clung to overcoats and crept into bones. Hercule Poirot, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, despite the weather, stood beneath the awning of the elegant Claridge's Hotel, his moustache twitching as he surveyed the street. The soft glow of gas lamps flickered, casting long shadows that danced like suspects in his mind. Tonight, he had orchestrated a gathering at dinner with the passengers of the ill-fated Prometheus flight, each a potential murderer hiding behind a mask of civility. His goal was not to accuse, but to observe, to stir the pot and watch what rose to the surface. The blowpipe, the venom, the wasp-hole, pieces of a puzzle that demanded a master of misdirection, and Poirot, with his little grey cells, was determined to unmask the artist behind it. Inside the private dining room was a study in opulence. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above a mahogany table draped in crisp white linen, silverware gleaming like polished clues. The air buzzed with forced politeness as the suspects arrived, their faces betraying flickers of unease. Jane Grey, the young hairdresser, entered first, her auburn curls catching the light, her eyes darting nervously as she adjusted her modest but stylish dress. Norman Gale, the dentist, followed, his smile as polished as ever, though Poirot noted a slight tightening at the corners of his mouth. The Countess of Horbury, Cicely, swept in with the arrogance of aristocracy, her emerald gown clinging to her frame, a cigarette holder dangling from her fingers like a prop in a play. Daniel Clancy, the mystery writer, shuffled in, his tweed jacket rumpled, his eyes darting as if plotting a novel in real time. The archaeologists, Armand and Jean Dupont, arrived together, their scholarly air tinged with a peculiar intensity, as if they carried secrets older than the ruins they studied. James Ryder, the businessman, rounded out the group, his brusque manner and ill-fitting suit marking him as out of place among the polished crowd. Poirot greeted each with a courteous nod, his eyes sharp as he catalogued their movements. Jane's fidgeting fingers, Gale's lingering glance at her, Cicely's impatient tap of her foot. The stewards, Henry Mitchell and Albert Davis, were absent, their roles in the flight too peripheral to warrant inclusion tonight, but Poirot had not ruled them out entirely. He had chosen this setting deliberately, a neutral ground where social masks could slip under the pressure of his subtle probing. The menu, a carefully curated selection of French dishes, was designed to evoke memories of the flight from Paris, a psychological nudge to unsettle the guilty dot. As the group settled, Poirot raised a glass of sparkling water. Wine would dull his senses and offered a toast. To clarity, he said, his voice smooth but edged with intent, and to the truth, which, like a star, shines brightest when all else is dark. The others raised their glasses, some with hesitation, others with forced cheer. Jane's smile was genuine but strained. Gale's was a perfect facsimile of warmth. Cicely's lips curled in a smirk, as if the toast amused her. The first course, a delicate consomme, arrived, and Poirot began his dance. "Mademoiselle Grey," he said, turning to Jane, "you have an eye for detail, Nan. A hairdresser must notice the smallest things, the tilt of a head, the texture of a curl. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual on the Prometheus?" Jane blushed, her spoon pausing mid-air. I was distracted, Monsieur. The flight was so exciting, being my first time in the air, but there was that wasp buzzing about. It was rather annoying." "Annoying?" "Yes," Poirot mused, his eyes flicking to Gale, who was watching Jane with an intensity that bordered on possessive. "And yet, a wasp is a small thing, easily overlooked, unlike a blowpipe, which is less discreet. Nest ceep." The word blowpipe landed like a stone in still water. Cicely's cigarette holder froze halfway to her lips. Clancy's fork clattered against his plate. Ryder coughed, reaching for his water. Gale alone remained composed, his smile unwavering. "A blowpipe," he said lightly, "sounds like something out of one of Mr. Clancy's novels. Hardly the sort of thing one expects on a modern airliner." "Indeed," Clancy interjected, his voice high with nervous energy. "I wrote a story once, The Serpent's Dart, where a jungle tribesman used a blowpipe too. Well, never mind. Pure fiction, of course." His laugh was brittle, and Poirot noted the way his fingers twisted his napkin. Poirot leaned back, his expression serene but his mind racing. The blowpipe was the key, a theatrical choice that screamed misdirection. Why use such a weapon in a confined cabin, where detection was almost certain? Unless the killer wanted it found, wanted the confusion, it would sow. He turned to the Duponts, who had been silent, their faces as inscrutable as the artifacts they studied. "Messieurs Dupont, your work takes you to distant lands, South America. Perhaps the blowpipe is a weapon of such places, is it not?" Armand Dupont, the elder, adjusted his spectacles. "We've excavated in Peru, yes, but blowpipe are tools of hunters. not murderers. Besides, our focus is pottery, not weaponry." His tone was measured, but his brother Jean's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation passing between them. "Pottery can hide secrets," Poirot said softly, "as can a plane's cabin, or a flute case perhaps." He let the words hang, watching for reactions. Gale's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and Poirot's pulse quickened. A flute case, long, narrow, easily mistaken for a blowpipe's container, had been noted in the luggage manifest. Gale, a dentist with a penchant for music, had mentioned playing the flute in passing during Japp's interviews. Was it a coincidence, or a clue hidden in plain sight? The main course, coq au vin, arrived, its rich aroma filling the room, but the atmosphere grew heavier. Cicely, her composure fraying, stubbed out her cigarette. "This is absurd," she snapped. "You're playing games, Monsieur Poirot, throwing out words like blowpipe to make us squirm. I had nothing to do with that dreadful woman's death. She was a moneylender, you know, hardly a saint. Madame Giselle's profession is well known," Poirot replied calmly, "as is her influence over certain individuals. Debts, secrecies, are powerful motives, Nan." His gaze lingered on Cicely, whose cheeks flushed, though whether from anger or guilt, he could not yet say. Jane, emboldened by the wine, spoke up. "Monsieur Poirot, you said the wasp was a distraction, but why? Surely no one could think a wasp carried snake venom." Her earnestness was disarming, and Poirot felt a pang of sympathy. She was caught in this web, her heart entangled with Gale, who sat too close, his hand brushing hers as he passed the salt. "The wasp," Poirot said, "is a sleight of hand, mademoiselle. It draws the eye, makes one think of stings and poison, while the true method, the blowpipe, slips into the shadows. The killer is clever, using the plane's chaos to their advantage." Ryder, who had been quiet, snorted. "Chaos? It was a routine flight, Poirot. People reading, sleeping, eating. Hardly a circus." His bluntness was refreshing, but Poirot noted the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool room. "Routine, Monsieur Ryder, is the perfect canvas for deception," Poirot said. "In a routine, one does not expect the extraordinary. And yet, a woman died, silently, among us all. The dessert, a tart tatin, was served, but few touched it. The conversation had turned the air brittle, each guest wary of the others. Poirot, sensing the moment was ripe, leaned forward. "Let us consider a hypothesis," he said, his voice low, commanding attention. "The blowpipe was not used during the flight's chaos, but in a moment of stillness when all eyes were elsewhere. Perhaps when the steward served coffee, or when the passengers turned to watch the channel below. The killer needed only seconds, a steady hand, and a perfect disguise." Clancy's eyes widened. "You mean, someone could have shot the dart right under our noses? That's preposterous, is it?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "The human eye sees what it expects to see. A man adjusting his tie, a woman fixing her hair, these are ordinary. But a dart, a breath through a tube, these are not." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. Cicely's hand trembled as she lit another cigarette. Gale's smile was gone, replaced by a thoughtful frown. Jane stared at Poirot, her expression a mix of awe and fear. The two exchanged a glance, their faces unreadable. Ryder pushed his plate away, muttering about indigestion. The dinner ended. The guests dispersed into the rainy night, their farewells curt and strained. Poirot lingered, thanking the staff, his mind already sifting through the evening's revelations. He had seen the cracks in their facade, Cicely's fear, Gale's calculated charm, Clancy's nervous chatter, but one detail burned brightest: the flute case, a potential hiding place for the blowpipe, and Gale's fleeting hesitation when it was mentioned outside. Jane caught up with him, her umbrella tilting against the drizzle. "Monsieur," she said, her voice trembling, "you think the killer was at that dinner, don't you?" "Someone I sat next to, talked to." Poirot studied her, seeing the innocence in her eyes, but also the shadow of doubt cast by her affection for Gale. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "the murderer is indeed close, hiding in plain sight. Their mask is nearly perfect, but no disguise can withstand the scrutiny of Hercule Poirot. But in its Chapter 9, the puzzle takes shape. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over Croydon Airport, its golden rays glinting off the polished hull of the Prometheus. Now grounded and silent, a monument to the tragedy it had unwittingly hosted. Poirot stood in the terminal's observation lounge, his small, fastidious figure framed against the vast window, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. He gazed not at the plain but at the horizon, where clouds gathered in brooding clusters, as if mirroring the storm brewing in his mind. The little grey cells, as he so fondly called them, were alight with activity, piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that had eluded him for too long. Inspector Japp, ever the pragmatist, paced nearby, his heavy footsteps a stark contrast to Poirot's stillness. "I don't know how you do it, Poirot," he muttered, flipping through a notebook crammed with scribbled notes. 11 suspects, a blowpipe, a poisoned thorn, and a blasted wasp. It's like trying to solve a riddle, written in a foreign language back. Poirot's mustache twitched, a faint smile betraying his amusement. "Mon ami, the language of crime is universal. It speaks in patterns, in habits, in the smallest of details. We are close, Japp, very close. But we must tread carefully, for the murderer is clever, so very clever." Jane Grey, seated on a cushioned bench nearby, looked up from her cup of tea, her hazel eyes clouded with worry. She had become Poirot's unlikely confidant, her earnestness and sharp observations proving useful despite her lack of investigative experience. "Monsieur Poirot," she ventured, her voice soft but steady, "do you really think the killer is still among us? That they could sit there, chatting and smiling, knowing what they've done?" Poirot turned, his gaze softening as it met hers. "Mademoiselle, the human heart is a labyrinth. Some hide their guilt behind a smile, others behind silence. But rest assured, the truth cannot hide forever not from Hercule Poirot." The investigation had reached a critical juncture. Over the past days, Poirot had unraveled layers of deception, Madame Giselle's blackmail empire, the cryptic note found in her luggage, the vanishing of her supposed daughter Anne Morisot, and the peculiar presence of a South American blowpipe in a modern airliner. Each clue was a thread, and now, in this 9th chapter of their aerial odyssey, Poirot was weaving them into a tapestry that would reveal the killer's face. The timeline's precision. Poirot's first task was to reconstruct the timeline of the fatal flight, a task he approached with the precision of a watchmaker. He had requisitioned a private room in the airport's administrative wing, a cramped space smelling of stale coffee and old paper. On a long table, he spread out a diagram of the Prometheus's rear compartment, meticulously drawn to scale. Each seat was marked with a name, a miniature portrait of suspicion: the Countess of Horbury in No. 13, Norman Gale in No. 17, Daniel Clancy in No. 4, the DuPonts in Nos. 5 and 6, and so on. At the center, in seat No. 2, was Madame Giselle, her name underlined in red ink, a silent accusation. Japp leaned over the diagram, his brow furrowed. "So, Poirot, you're saying the thorn was shot from this blowpipe during the flight, right? Under our noses, in a cabin full of people." "Precisement," Poirot replied, tapping the diagram with a pencil. "But consider, mon ami, the constraints of the act. The blowpipe is not a subtle weapon. It requires space, breath, and aim. To use it unnoticed in a crowded cabin, with stewards passing and passengers shifting, is a feat of audacity. We must determine when it could have been done." Jane, standing at Poirot's side, pointed to the timeline scribbled on a chalkboard. "The stewards served coffee about 20 minutes before the landing, didn't they?" Henry Mitchell said. He noticed Madame Giselle was asleep then, but she might already have been dead. Poirot nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Exactement, mademoiselle. The coffee service is our anchor." It lasted approximately 10 minutes, during which Mitchell and Albert Davis moved through the aisle, their trays blocking the view. This was the moment of opportunity, a brief window when attention was distracted. Japp scratched his chin. But who had the chance to aim a blowpipe in that chaos? And why not just poison her drink? Seems a lot less theatrical. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Theatricality, Japp, is sometimes the point. The blowpipe is a statement, a flourish. It tells us the killer wished to dazzle, to confuse, but they underestimated Hercule Poirot." He turned to the chalkboard, adding a new column labeled Movements. With swift, precise strokes, he noted each passenger's actions during the coffee service, based on their statements and the steward's observations. The Countess of Horbury had been fidgeting with her handbag. Norman Gale had been reading a dental journal. Daniel Clancy had been scribbling in a notebook, and the DuPonts had been deep in conversation about an obscure Mesopotamian artifact. Yet one detail nagged at Poirot. The steward, Albert Davis, had mentioned a passenger standing briefly to adjust their luggage in the overhead rack, momentarily blocking his view of the rear compartment. Who was this passenger? Poirot mused aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. And what were they truly doing? The Dupont's secrets do test his suspicions. Poirot requested a meeting with Armand and Jean Dupont, the father and son, archaeologists whose reserved demeanor hid a wealth of specialized knowledge. They met in a quiet corner of the airport's lounge, where the hum of departing planes provided a subtle backdrop. Armand, the elder, was a wiry man with a hawkish face, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Jean, younger and more animated, carried an air of restless energy, his fingers drumming on the table. Monsieur Dupont Poirot began, addressing the father. Your work in Mesopotamia is most fascinating. Tell me, does it ever involve the study of poisons, perhaps those used in ancient rituals? Armand's expression remained impassive, but his fingers tightened around his coffee cup. Our focus is on pottery and inscriptions, Monsieur Poirot. Poisons are not our domain, Jean interjected, his tone eager. Though, father, we did find references to toxins in Sumerian text extracts from plants and reptiles, used for hunting or ceremonies. Fascinating stuff, but hardly relevant here. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And yet, a poison of South American origin, delivered by a blowpipe, has ended a life on this very flight. A curious coincidence. Nan the Dupont exchanged a glance, subtle but telling. Armand spoke carefully. Coincidence, perhaps, but we are scholars, not assassins. During the coffee service, we were discussing a cuneiform tablet, hardly the moment for such a deed. Poirot tilted his head, his voice soft but probing. And yet, Monsieur Jean, you were seen adjusting your luggage during that service. A moment when eyes were elsewhere. Perhaps. Jean flushed, his hands stilled. I merely needed my notebook. The overhead rack was cluttered, and I didn't want it to fall. Poirot smiled, but it was a smile that promised further scrutiny. Merci, messieurs. Your cooperation is noted. We shall speak again. As the Duponts departed, Jane whispered, Do you think they're hiding something? They seemed so guarded. Poirot nodded slowly. They know more than they say, mademoiselle. But whether it is guilt or merely fear, I cannot yet say. Clancy's fictional clues. Next, Poirot turned his attention to Daniel Clancy, the eccentric mystery writer whose novels had an unsettling habit of mirroring reality. They met in a small cafe near the airport, its walls adorned with faded aviation posters. Clancy, with his disheveled hair and ink-stained fingers, looked every inch the distracted artist. He clutched a tattered notebook, its pages filled with scrawled ideas for his next novel. Monsieur Clancy, Poirot began, stirring his espresso with deliberate care. Your stories are most instructive. In The Crimson Dart, you describe a murder by blowpipe, using a poison derived from a rare frog. A striking similarity. Clancy's eyes widened, and he laughed nervously. Pure coincidence, Monsieur Poirot. I pluck ideas from thin air newspapers, history, my imagination. Blowpipes are exotic, aren't they? Perfect for a thriller. Poirot leaned forward, his voice low. And yet, you were seated in No. For a mere 2 rows from Madame Giselle. During the coffee service, you were writing, were you not? Perhaps you saw something or did something. Clancy's laughter faded, replaced by a defensive edge. Writing, yes. I was jotting down a scene about a smuggler. Nothing to do with blowpipes. I barely noticed the stewards, let alone anyone else. Poirot's gaze was unrelenting. And what of your notebook, monsieur? Might I see it? Clancy hesitated, then slid the notebook across the table. Poirot flipped through it, his eyes scanning the chaotic script. Amidst plot outlines and character sketches was a curious diagram, a crude sketch of a blowpipe, annotated with notes on trajectory and wind resistance. Poirot's eyebrow rose, but he closed the notebook without comment. Most interesting, he said, his tone neutral. We shall speak again, Monsieur Clancy. As Clancy scurried away, Japp, who had been listening from a nearby table, joined. Poirot, that chop's a odd one. You think he's our man? Poirot shook his head. He is a dreamer, Japp, but dreams can be dangerous. His knowledge is suspicious, yet I sense he is not the architect of this crime. Perhaps a witness, or a pawn, a financial thread. The breakthrough came later that evening, when Japp burst into Poirot's temporary office, his face flushed with excitement. Got something, Poirot? Norman Gale's financials, they're a mess. Turns out he's been borrowing heavily from a shady lender in Paris. Guess who? Giselle's outfit. He's in debt up to his eyeballs. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Formidable, Jap. This is the thread we needed. Monsieur Gale, with his charming smile and dental tools, has been too perfect, too composed. But now, we see the crack in his facade. Jane, who had been sorting through passenger statements, looked up sharply. Norman, but he's been so kind, so normal. Could he really? Poirot held up a hand. Mademoiselle, the most dangerous wolves were the softest wool. We must confront him, but with care. He is clever, and he knows we are closing in. They arranged to meet Gale at his dental practice, a sleek office in Harley Street, lined with gleaming instruments and the faint scent of antiseptic. Gale greeted them with his usual charm, his white coat pristine, his smile disarming. Monsieur Poirot, Inspector Japp, Miss Grey, what a surprise. How can I assist? Poirot's tone was deceptively mild. Monsieur Gale, we are curious about your travels. You fly often between London and Paris, and yet your practice is thriving. How do you manage such debts? Gale's smile faltered, but only for a moment. Debts? Oh, the usual business loans. Dentistry is expensive to maintain equipment. Staff, you know. Japp snorted. Loans from Madame Giselle. You mean, we've got records. Gale, you owed her thousands. Enough to make a man desperate. Gale's hands clenched, but he laughed lightly. Desperate? Hardly. I was managing. Besides, I was reading during the flight. Didn't even notice the poor woman until the steward screamed. Poirot's eyes locked onto Gale's. And yet, monsieur, you were seen adjusting your bag during the coffee service. A dental case. Perhaps one that could conceal a blowpipe. Gale's composure cracked, his face paling. That's absurd. I'm a dentist, not a jungle warrior. Poirot smiled faintly. We shall see, monsieur. We shall see. The final clue. Back at the airport, Poirot retreated to his office, spreading out the seating chart once more. He stared at it, his mind racing. The blowpipe, the thorn, the timing all pointed to a killer who knew the cabin's layout intimately, who could act in seconds without being seen. The luggage adjustment, the distracted stewards, the wasp's deception. It was a performance, a sleight of hand. He picked up a pencil and circled a name on the chart. Norman Gale, seat no. 17. Oui, he murmured. It is you, monsieur, but I must prove it beyond doubt. Jane, watching him, frowned. Monsieur Poirot, how can you be so sure? What if it's the Duponts, with their poison knowledge, or Clancy, with his blowpipe obsession? Poirot turned to her, his expression grave but kind. Mademoiselle, the truth is in the details. The Duponts know poisons, but their manner is cautious, not cunning. Clancy writes of crime, but his mind is scattered, not precise. Gale, however, has the motive, the opportunity, and the skill. His dental tools could conceal a blowpipe, his charm could disarm suspicion, and his debts provide the reason. But we need one final piece, a witness, perhaps, or a mistake he cannot hide. As night fell over Croydon, Poirot stood alone by the window, the Prometheus looming in the darkness. The puzzle was nearly complete, the killer's name etched in his mind. Tomorrow, at the gathering of suspects, he would lay his trap, and the sky would clear at last. Chapter 10. The sky clears. The late afternoon sun cast a golden sheen over Croydon Airport, its rays glinting off the sleek fuselage of the airliner Prometheus, now grounded and silent, a mute witness to the crime that had unfolded within its metal walls. The terminal, a cavernous space of polished floors and echoing footsteps, buzzed with a restless energy as passengers, reporters, and airport staff milled about, their whispers forming a low hum of anticipation. Hercule Poirot stood at the center of it all, his diminutive figure commanding the room with an air of quiet authority. His black patent leather shoes gleamed, his mustache was impeccably waxed, and his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, surveyed the gathered suspects with a piercing intensity. Inspector Japp, his broad shoulders hunched in his overcoat, paced nearby, muttering about the press, hounding him for answers. This blasted case, Poirot, he grumbled, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow despite the autumn chill. The papers are calling it the Sky Murder. They'll have my head if we don't wrap this up clean. Poirot's lips curled into a faint, enigmatic smile. Patience, mon ami. The truth, like a fine wine, requires time to breathe. And today, it shall breathe freely. The suspects, 11 in total, had been summoned to a private lounge overlooking the tarmac. The room, with its plush leather chairs and a long mahogany table, felt more like a courtroom than a waiting area. The passengers from that fateful flight Paris to London, seat by seat, life by life, sat in uneasy silence, their faces a gallery of nerves, defiance, and poorly concealed guilt. Jane Grey, the young hairdresser, fidgeted with her scarf, her eyes darting toward Norman Gale, the dentist, whose easy charm had won her heart. The Countess of Horbury, her elegance frayed by days of scrutiny, clutched a cigarette holder with trembling fingers. Daniel Clancy, the mystery writer, scribbled furiously in a notebook, as if plotting his next novel could shield him from suspicion. The archaeologists Armand and Jean Dupont sat stiffly, their faces unreadable, while businessman James Ryder tapped his foot incessantly, his gaze fixed on the floor. The stewards, Henry Mitchell and Albert Davis, hovered near the door, their uniforms crisp but their expressions wary. Poirot stepped forward, his cane tapping lightly against the polished floor. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice clear and resonant, cutting through the tension like a blade. "We are gathered here to resolve a most peculiar crime, committed not on the earth but in the heavens, aboard the Prometheus. Madame Giselle, a woman of secrets, was struck down by a poisoned thorn, delivered by a blowpipe, a weapon as audacious as it is precise. Today, Hercule Poirot will reveal the one among you who dared to play God in the skies." A murmur rippled through the room. The Countess of Horbury's cigarette holder clattered to the table, and Jane Grey's breath hitched audibly. Norman Gale leaned back in his chair, his smile unwavering but his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Poirot paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Let us begin with the facts. Madame Giselle, a moneylender and blackmailer, held power over many. Her death was no accident but a calculated act to silence her forever. The weapon, a thorn tipped with snake venom, propelled by a blowpipe found beneath my own seat. A wasp, discovered in a coffee cup, was meant to mislead us, a clumsy deception, but effective in its chaos." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "The question is not only who, but how. The Prometheus is a confined space, a metal box soaring at 10,000 feet. To commit such a crime requires nerve, precision, and an intimate knowledge of the cabin's rhythm. Let us reconstruct the moment of murder." Poirot gestured to a large diagram of the plane's seating arrangement, propped on an easel. Madame Giselle sat in seat 12, in the rear compartment. The blowpipe, a crude but effective tool, required a clear line of sight and a moment when all eyes were distracted. The stewards were serving coffee, the passengers were eating or reading, and I, Hercule Poirot, was last battling my own discomfort with air travel. The killer seized this moment, but how did they conceal their actions? Jane Grey spoke up, her voice trembling but resolute. "Mr. Poirot, could it have been quick? A flick of the wrist, maybe, when no one was looking?" Poirot's eyes softened as he regarded her. "A fine question, Mademoiselle Grey. Quick, yes, but not invisible. The blowpipe is long, awkward to maneuver in a cramped cabin, and yet no one saw it used. Why? Because the killer was a master of misdirection." He turned to Norman Gale, who sat with his arms crossed, his smile now tinged with unease. "Monsieur Gale, you are a dentist, n'est-ce pas? A man of precision, accustomed to working with small instruments in confined spaces. Your charm has been noted, particularly by Mademoiselle Grey, but charm can be a mask, can it not?" Gale's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "I'm flattered by your attention, Mr. Poirot, but I'm just a dentist, not a magician. I was busy flirting with Jane during the flight, hardly the time for murder." The room chuckled nervously, but Poirot's expression remained stern. "Flirtation, Monsieur Gale, is an excellent distraction. It draws eyes to your smile, not your hands, and your hands, I suspect, were busy indeed." Japp stepped forward, his voice gruff. "Get to the point, Poirot. You've got a theory, don't you?" Poirot nodded. "Indeed, Inspector. Let us consider the blowpipe. It was found under my seat, a bold attempt to cast suspicion on me, or to suggest carelessness by the killer. But I, Poirot, am not so easily fooled. The blowpipe was not a native tool of the Prometheus. It was brought aboard, disguised as something innocuous. Monsieur Gale, your dental bag did it not contain a long, slender case, perhaps for a specialized tool?" Gale's face paled, but he laughed. "A dental probe, Maybe. You're reaching, Mr. Poirot. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Not a probe, monsieur. A flute case, perhaps, or something similar. Easily mistaken for a dental instrument, but perfect for concealing a blowpipe. You see, I have examined your bag, with Inspector Japp's permission. A curious item, that case, lined with velvet, just the right size. The room fell silent. Jane Grey's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. The Countess of Horbury lit another cigarette, her hands shaking. Daniel Clancy stopped scribbling, his pen frozen mid-sentence. Poirot continued, his voice steady but relentless. The venom, too, points to you, Monsieur Gale. As a dentist, you have access to chemicals, perhaps even exotic ones through medical suppliers. Snake venom, while rare, is not impossible to procure for a man of your resources. And your motive, Madame Giselle's ledgers, discovered by Inspector Japp, reveal you owed her a substantial sum, debts you could not repay without ruin. Gale stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is absurd. I'm no murderer. You've got no proof, just wild theories. Japp raised a hand. Sit down, Gale. Let him finish. Poirot's smile was cold. Proof, monsieur. Let us discuss the thorn. It was delivered with precision, striking Madame Giselle's neck as she dozed. The stewards were busy, the passengers distracted, but you, Monsieur Gale, were seated in seat 10, just across the aisle. A quick movement, shielded by your newspaper, or your charming conversation with Mademoiselle Grey, and the deed was done. The wasp, a clever touch, planted in the coffee cup to suggest a natural death, but the blowpipe, discarded under my seat, was your mistake. You assumed it would implicate another, but it led me to you. Jane's voice broke the silence, soft and pained. Norman, tell me it's not true. You couldn't have. Gale's composure cracked, his eyes darting to the door. Jane, this is nonsense. I'm not some cold-blooded killer. Poirot stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. But you are, Monsieur Gale. Cold, yes, but not without calculation. You courted Mademoiselle Grey to keep her eyes on you, not your actions. You used the plane's confines to your advantage, knowing suspicion would scatter like dust. But Hercule Poirot sees through the dust. The seating chart, the timeline, the venom all point to you. Japp signaled to 2 constables, who moved to flank Gale. Norman Gale, you're under arrest for the murder of Madame Giselle. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Jane buried her face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. The Countess of Horbury exhaled a plume of smoke, her relief palpable. Daniel Clancy scribbled furiously, muttering, "Brilliant twist. Must use this." Gale's shoulders slumped as the constables led him away, his charm replaced by a hollow defiance. "You've got the wrong man, Poirot," he spat. "You'll see." Poirot watched him go, his expression unreadable. He turned to Jane, his voice gentle. "Mademoiselle, the heart is a fragile thing, but it heals. You are innocent, and for that, I am glad." Jane nodded, her voice barely audible. "I trusted him. How could I be so blind?" Poirot placed a hand on her shoulder. "The heart sees what it wishes to see, but the truth, it always emerges." As the suspects dispersed, Japp approached Poirot, a grudging respect in his eyes. "You've done it again, you old fox. How'd you know it was Gale?" Poirot tapped his temple. "The little grey cells, mon ami. They see what others miss, the patterns, the inconsistencies. Gale's charm was too perfect, his alibi too polished, and the blowpipe, so carelessly discarded, screamed of a man who thought himself untouchable." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The Prometheus stood silent, its next flight hours away. Chapter 11. The Reckoning at Croydon. The Croydon aerodrome buzzed with a restless energy as the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the tarmac. The Prometheus, now grounded, stood like a silent witness to the drama unfolding within. Its sleek fuselage, Hercule Poirot, his Homburg hat tilted slightly against the glare, stood at the center of the airliner's cabin, his small, precise figure commanding the attention of the 11 passengers and 2 stewards gathered before him. The air was thick with tension, the kind that precedes a storm, and every eye was fixed on the diminutive detective. The murder of Madame Giselle, the notorious French moneylender, had cast a pall over the flight from Paris to London, and now, in this final reckoning, Poirot was ready to unveil the truth. The passengers sat in their original seats, as Poirot had insisted, their faces a gallery of emotions: fear, curiosity, defiance. Jane Grey, the young hairdresser in seat No. 10, clutched her hands in her lap, her auburn curls framing a face pale with anticipation. Norman Gale, the dentist in seat No. 1, maintained his boyish charm, but his smile was strained, his eyes darting to Jane and then away. The Countess of Horbury, in seat No. 2, sat with her fur stole draped carelessly. Her dark eyes narrowed as she lit another cigarette, the flame trembling in her hand. Daniel Clancy, the mystery writer, in seat No. 8, scribbled furiously in his notebook, as if trying to outpace the unfolding reality with his own fiction. The DuPonts, father and son archaeologists, in seats No. 5 and 6, whispered in French, their tweed suits rumpled from the long day. James Ryder, the businessman in seat No. 4, tapped his foot impatiently, while the quieter passengers, the doctor and the spinster, watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. Inspector Japp, standing near the galley with his arms crossed, gave Poirot a nod. "Right, Poirot, let's have it. You've kept us waiting long enough. Who did it?" His gruff voice carried a hint of exasperation, but his eyes gleamed with trust in his old friend's methods. Poirot raised a hand, his gloved fingers commanding silence. "Patience, mon ami," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, yet sharp, enough to cut through the murmurs. "The truth, it is like a fine tapestried thread, must be placed with care, or the picture is lost. We stand here, in the cabin of the Prometheus, where Madame Giselle met her end, struck by a poisoned thorn delivered with a crime audacious, impossible, and yet it was done, and the one who did it sits among us now." A gasp rippled through the cabin. Jane's hands tightened, and the Countess's cigarette paused halfway to her lips. Clancy's pen froze, ink blotting his page. Poirot's green eyes swept the room, missing nothing: the flicker of fear in Ryder's scowl, the subtle shift in Gale's posture, the way the DuPonts leaned closer to each other. "Let us begin," Poirot said, pacing slowly down the aisle, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. Madame Giselle was no ordinary woman, a moneylender, oui, but also a keeper of secrets. Her ledger, found among her possessions, contained names, debts, and indiscretion, secrets worth killing to protect. But the method of her death, it is most curious. A blowpipe, a weapon of the jungles, used in the confines of an airliner soaring over the channel. Why such a choice? Why not a knife, a poison in her coffee, a simple push from a cliff? The answer, mise Amos, lies in the psychology of the killer. He paused beside Madame Giselle's empty seat, No. 12, where the memory of her lifeless form lingered. The blowpipe was found beneath my own seat, No. 9, a fact that briefly cast suspicion upon Hercule Poirot. He allowed himself a small, theatrical smile. "But I assure you, I am not so clumsy as to leave such evidence. The blowpipe was placed there, a deliberate act to mislead. And then, there was the waspo, that troublesome wasp, buzzing about Mademoiselle Grey's window. A clever distraction, Nan, to make us think it delivered the fatal sting. But the thorn, coated with snake venom, tells a different story." Jane Grey spoke up, her voice trembling but clear. "Monsieur Poirot, you're saying someone planned this down to the wasp, but how could they know it wouldn't be noticed?" Poirot turned to her, his expression softening. "A fine question, mademoiselle. The wasp was no accident. It was introduced, perhaps in a small container, released at the precise moment to create confusion. The killer relied on the chaos of a crowded cabin, the distraction of a routine flight, and they knew the habits of their fellow passengers, knew, for instance, that I, Poirot, am often indisposed during flights, unlikely to notice subtle movements." Norman Gale leaned forward, his voice light but edged with nervousness. "That's all very clever, Monsieur Poirot, but you're making it sound like a stage play. Surely it's simpler: someone had a grudge, saw their chance, and took it." Poirot's eyes locked onto Gale's, and for a moment the cabin seemed to hold its breath. "Simplicity, Monsieur Gale, is the refuge of the unimaginative. This was no crime of passion. This was a performance, meticulously rehearsed. Let us consider the passengers, shall we?" He began to move again, stopping beside each seat as he spoke. "Madame la Comtesse de Horbury," he said, pausing by seat No. 2, "your debts to Madame Giselle were substantial, and her knowledge of your personal habits was a threat. You were seen to be agitated during the flight, your hands unsteady, and yet your seat is far from the victim's. Could you have crossed the aisle unnoticed? The Countess exhaled a plume of smoke, her smile brittle. You're fishing, Monsieur Poirot. I had no reason to kill her debts. Everyone has them, and I don't play with blowpipe. Poirot inclined his head, unperturbed. We shall see, Madame. He moved to the Duponts, Messieurs Armand and Jean Dupont. Your work in archaeology takes you to distant lands, where such weapons as blowpipes are not unknown. Your conversation during the flight was intense, secretive. Did Madame Giselle know something of your expeditions? Perhaps a relic smuggled, a deal gone wrong? Armand Dupont, the elder, bristled. This is absurd. We are scholars, not murderers. Our work is with the past, not with poison. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable, and continued to James Ryder. Monsieur Ryder, your business dealings were tangled with Giselle's loans. Your temper during the flight was evident, your complaints loud. Did you seek to silence a creditor who knew too much? Ryder's face reddened. I didn't like the woman, I'll admit, but kill her, in front of everyone. I'm not a fool. Poirot, the detective, moved on, pausing by Daniel Clancy. Monsieur Clancy, your novels are filled with clever murders, poisoned darts, hidden motives. You were seen scribbling during the flight, perhaps plotting more than fiction. And your seat, no, 8, is close to the victims. Clancy laughed nervously, his glasses slipping down his nose. You flatter me, sir. My murders stay on the page. I wouldn't know where to get snake venom, let alone use it. Finally Poirot stopped beside Norman Gale. And you, Monsieur Gale, the charming dentist. Your seat, no, 1, is across the aisle, but your profession gives you access to 2, perhaps, or knowledge of poisons, and your interest in Mademoiselle Grey genuine, or a distraction. Gale's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. I'm just a dentist, Poirot. I fix teeth, not murder people. And Jane, Miss Grey can tell you I was with her most of the flight. Jane blushed, her eyes dropping to her lap. Poirot noted the exchange, his mind cataloguing every nuance. He turned to the group as a whole. Each of you had opportunity, each of you had motive, but only one had the precision, the audacity, to execute this crime. Let us reconstruct the flight. He paced to the center of the cabin, his cane tapping rhythmically. The Prometheus was in mid-flight, the passengers distracted, reading, talking, sleeping. I, Poirot, was battling my mal de l'air, my eyes often closed. The stewards, Messieurs Mitchell and Davis, were busy with their duties. The blowpipe, small and collapsible, could be concealed in a pocket, a bag, even a dental case. The thorn, dipped in venom, was fired with a puff of breath, striking Madame Giselle in the neck. She died quickly, silently, her ledger still in her lap. The killer then placed the blowpipe under my seat, a bold misdirection, and released the wasp to sow confusion. Japp interrupted, his brow furrowed. But Poirot, the timing, how could anyone do all that without being seen? The cabin's small. The stewards were moving about. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Exactement, Inspector. The killer relied on the rhythm of the flight, the moments when attention was elsewhere. The stewards were serving coffee, the passengers were distracted, and the killer was someone who blended into that rhythm, someone whose presence was unremarkable, whose actions seemed innocent. He turned abruptly to Norman Gale. Monsieur Gale, you are a dentist. Your profession requires precision, dexterity. You carry tools, small, sharp instruments, and your case, it was searched, was it not? A flute case, Inspector Japp found, but no flute. Curious, Nan, a blowpipe perhaps, disguised as a harmless instrument. Gale's face drained of color. That's ridiculous. My case, it's just for show, a gift from a patient. I didn't. Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. And your finances, Monsieur? Madame Giselle's ledger revealed a loan to you, a substantial sum, unpaid. She held a secret over you, did she not? A secret that threatened your reputation, your future, and your flirtation with Mademoiselle Grit kept her attention, kept her from noticing your movements. Jane gasped, her eyes wide. Norman, that's not true, is it? You said you liked me. Gale's charm crumbled, his voice sharp. Don't listen to him, Jane. He's grasping at straws. I didn't kill anyone. But Poirot was relentless. The thorn, monsieur, was no ordinary dart. It was coated with a rare venom curare, accessible to a dentist who might procure such substances under the guise of medical research. You prepared the thorn in advance, carried it in your case, and waited for the moment when the cabin was distracted. You fired the blowpipe, a quick, silent act, and then hid it beneath my seat, knowing suspicion would fall elsewhere. The wasp, released from a small vial, completed your misdirection. The Countess of Horbury laughed, a brittle sound. A dentist. Really, Poirot, that's a stretch. Why not me? I had more reason than most. Poirot turned to her, his smile enigmatic. Madame, your debts were great, but your fear was greater. You suspected Giselle's blackmail, but you lacked the precision for this crime. No, the killer was someone who could move unnoticed, someone whose charm disarmed suspicion. He faced Gale again. Monsieur Gale, your alibi depends on Mademoiselle Gray, but she was reading, distracted by your conversation. The stewards confirm you stood briefly, ostensibly to adjust your bag. That was your moment. And the ledger, it confirms your debtor. Motive as old as time. Japp stepped forward, his face grim. That's enough, Poirot. Gale, you're coming with us. We'll sort this out at the station. Gale lunged to his feet, his voice rising. You've got nothing, no proof, just theories. I'm innocent. But Poirot's voice was calm, unyielding. The proof, monsieur, is in your case. Inspector Japp, if you examine it now, you will find traces of the venom hidden in a compartment. And the flute casing matches the blowpipe's dimensions exactly. Japp nodded to a constable, who retrieved Gale's bag from the overhead rack. A tense silence followed as the constable opened it, revealing a small vial and a collapsible tube disguised as a flute. Japp's eyes widened. Good God, Poirot, you're right. Gale slumped, his face crumpling. I had no choice. She was going to ruin me, my practice, my life, everything. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Jane's eyes filled with tears, her voice barely a whisper. Norman, how could you? Poirot's expression softened as he looked at her. Mademoiselle, the heart is easily deceived, but it is also resilient. You will heal. The passengers watched in stunned silence as Gale was led away, his hands cuffed. The Countess stubbed out her cigarette, her face unreadable. Clancy closed his notebook, muttering, better than my novels. The Duponts exchanged a glance, their relief palpable. Ryder cleared his throat, looking away. Japp clapped Poirot on the shoulder. You've done it again, old man. I don't know how you do it, but I'm glad you're on our side. Poirot adjusted his hat, his mustache twitching. It is the order, Inspector, the symmetry of the mind. Crime disrupts it, and I restore it. As the passengers filed out, Poirot lingered, his gaze sweeping the empty cabin. The Prometheus was still, its engines silent, its secrets laid bare. He stepped onto the tarmac, the sun now dipping toward the horizon, casting the airliner in a warm, golden glow. The case was closed, the killer unmasked, but Poirot felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved. He walked away, his cane tapping softly, as the aerodrome prepared for the next flight. The sky above, vast and indifferent, holding its secrets close.